Sorry, boy, but his captain's got to teach his men what happens to those what crossing.
Captain's got to teach stuff.
Good morning from the Bat Cave. It is Friday. It is June 27, 2025, and we are going to get deep into the weeds into Egyptology here. If you guys have watched my other Serpent by the Way content, we focused a lot on what was going on in Assyria and Sumer and Akkad, and to a lesser extent Mari, which is where we're going to have a lot of the early ancient Near Eastern gods appear from. Again, my overarching theory about the ancient Near Eastern gods is pretty simple. They're based on an original trinity, if you will, of a transcendent father god, a spirit that gives you the breath of life, and then a sun god, which is basically man's version of Yahweh, if you will, and then serpent god, which is Satan. And based on everything I'm discovering, what we seem to have here is that everybody once had, like, the contents of Genesis 1 through 6, or Genesis 1 through 9, I should really say, everything leading up to the flood, everything that came out of the mouth of Noah, everybody seemed to have had. Probably not in writing. It was probably an oral tradition that was so common. And again, this is not that long. I mean, we were talking about Genesis 1 through 6. These are fireside stories you could tell over and over and over again, and the exact words of the story everybody would know. And what it seems like is these stories were analyzed to death after the death of Noah and the patriarchs, because these guys lived so much longer than everybody else. And within about, this is why the whole idea of the Tower of Babel happened in the days of Peleg is so stupid. Why would God, Peleg is like a grandson of Noah about 100 years later. You're talking about a population that would have probably been no more than 1,000. Why would God divide them throughout the earth when there's only 1,000 people? It's not going to do that. The Tower of Babel is going to take place in the time of Hammurabi, when there's millions of people. And Moses is just writing about it before he writes about where Abraham came from, because he's describing where all the different languages came from before he describes the story of Abraham. Well, everything in this seems to have been analyzed to death by everybody. And what we're going to find when we get to Egypt, which is distinct from Sumer, in Sumer, you're going to have a lot of stuff that's very clear that they're basing it on this. And again, Sumer and Akkad, remember, they're largely influenced by Semitic peoples, which is where Abraham and his family comes from. And they're going to have a mythology that is closer to what we would find in the Bible. Egypt is going to be different. Egypt seems to believe very early on, and again, most of what we have in terms of analysis and explanation of the gods and stuff like that is going to be much later than they're going to claim this stuff is dated to. They're going to be looking at artifacts, and what they're going to be do is say, well, that's that god so-and-so, and then they're going to look at stuff that was written 1,000 years later that they have in papyrus and be like, well, this is what people believed about that god. Well, those beliefs weren't necessarily around 1,000 years before. They just have an inscription in stone or sandstone or something that signifies that god, and these gods you're going to find out have tons of different names because Egypt has 5 different language groups in it, and then the Hebrews were there. And you're going to find out that they're constantly merging gods. They are constantly, Amun-Ra is literally Ham and Utu. It's basically the sun god and Ham. They're merging those together, but they're going to merge 2 or 3 gods together, and they're actually going to come up with trinities, which are, this. It seems like trinities come from Egypt. The idea of taking 3 gods and merging them all together into one god and somehow making it like all 3 but also one. This has a lot to do with the Book of the Dead, because the Book of the Dead is going to over and over again say that god's really that god, but some say he's that god and some say he's that god. And what it is the Book of the Dead seems to be, if you understand that the Tower of Babel happens and it's the cause of Joseph's famine, what Joseph does during that famine, so this is going to be in a period of within a few years of Joseph being seen with an interpreter for the first time, he is going to take these 5 Egyptian tribes who get 5 different languages from the Tower of Babel, and he's going to move them all over Egypt with the exception of the priesthood. they're going to continue ruling for about 150 years. And it's in that 150 years that the Book of the Dead seems to be composed. And around the time that the oldest copy of the Book of the Dead that we have, that we can find, that's when the Jews get overthrown. So what it seems to be is like an attempt at renaissance of the old Egyptian god system, because under Joseph and all those guys, remember, Joseph is married to the priest of On, which is where Ra is centered. Where Ra, the worship of Ra is centered. Well, if Ra is Utu and the son of righteousness, and literally they're calling him the son of justice, which is the same way of saying the son of righteousness, well, then what we're going to have is a bunch of Egyptian priests, or I'm sorry, you're going to have the cult of Ra being the dominant cult, the people who worship Ra being the dominant people, and you're going to expect to find Ra in all their names. Well, if we go to the Turin Kings list, which is the oldest Kings list that we have, and we look at the kings' names from that period, and this is going to be the period just prior to the Hyksos ruling, because this is going to be the kings that would have co-ruled with Joseph. Remember, Ra is already a major cult center for these kings, and Egypt is not united at the time, okay? You're going to expect to find Ra all over the place. And look, this R-E at the end is Ra. Ra, 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 Ra. I mean, you have one exception, and then Ra, 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 Ra. Another exception, Ra, Ra. Hotep, I think, means is satisfied. You see Amen, that's Ham. But when you see this R-E at the end, that's Ra. Again and again and again, you're going to find Ra worship. Well, that's because Ra is Utu. Ra is the son of justice. That was how people understood the Lord until you find out the Hyksos are associated with Set. Well, why are the Hyksos associated with Set? Well, Set is just one way of saying the name. Remember, the Egyptians have 5 languages. Another way of saying it is Seth. And if the original division of mankind was between the descendants of Cain and the descendants of Seth, before they knew the name of their God, he would have been called the Son of Justice. And they understood that he was not the sun itself. He was a God that was associated with the sun, who is watching you during the daytime, who comes down in the cool of the evening, and he knows what you've done. Okay? So that's where the whole idea of the all-seeing eye comes from. It's literally, you find this stuff, and you're going to find an all-seeing eye of Ra and an all-seeing eye of Horus. Well, Horus is based on a falcon god, which is a raptor. In fact, it's the largest raptor in Egypt. Okay? Well, think about why you might have a guy who's associated with an all-seeing God, who's associated with God, who is associated with a raptor. It's Enoch. Enoch gets raptured, and so you're going to have a raptor associated with him. And that's not the original name for him. Horus is going to develop over time. The original name seems to be this Nemti. Now, I don't know what Nemti means. I haven't done an etymological study on this. But the original 3 gods of Egypt that I can find, based on my research. Now, there's a bunch of older gods, but these are some of the oldest. You have Nemti. You have this guy, Min, who has an erection, which I believe is their first Nephilim king. And then you have, and he seems to be the same guy as the Scorpion king. And then you have the third one is going to be Set. And Ra is right back there with them, but he's called Aten and Atum, which I believe is them literally merging the sun god with Adam. What they claim to be is their oldest artifact is this thing called the Narmer palette. And just like in Sumer, we have their kings depicted as giants next to these other people who are much smaller. Why? Well, I would suggest to you because their first kings were Nephilim. Okay? Now, when you study the Nephilim, you find out that they're Gibberim, and we showed you this with David's Mighty Men. A Gibberim is basically just a warlord. It's like a guy like Achilles from Troy, where he's not really a king in the sense of having... when we think of king in the classical sense, we think of somebody who inherited power from their father, and they're from a line of kings that back then they would have said were descended from the gods originally. But it was essentially the patriarchy. It was people who inherited rule, being the firstborn son and the firstborn of blah, 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 or whoever was chosen by the father to be the next king. Okay? That's not where the original kings come from. You got to remember, The original rulers of these people, the original patriarchy, were priests, not kings, because kings were the people who would judge people and lead them to war. A priest is somebody who would intercede between people, and so they would judge too, but their judgment was based on what is God's will and how do I mediate this dispute between these people. That's what their judgment was, because there's no war. So once war starts happening, you start having two kinds of rulers. You have these priest kings, and then you have these warlords. And you find these people in Sumer called Lugals, or big man. That's literally what Lugal means. Well, it's not too hard to take the leap from maybe that's what the Bible is referring to, mighty men, men of renown, okay? Big men, okay? It also literally is big man. And you find these people depicted as larger men. Well, who does the Bible says becomes the mighty men, men of renown? The Nephilim do, okay? So what seems to happen is that I would assume the word big man and mighty man are indistinguishable. And I don't think all Lugals are Nephilim. But I do think it starts as a big man being a man who is essentially a warlord. And it starts out with the descendants of Lamech and Tubal-Cain, because they know how to make metal weapons, become some of the first to take and seize power by force. And that's where you're going to get the vulture stele, and you're going to get the whole story of the first battle over Gu Eden, which is the border of Eden. That's the first recorded war we know in all of human history. And this is going to happen around 2900 BCE, okay? Well, the oldest stuff they claim to have in Egypt is 3100 BCE. And this is where Egyptologists, I think, are wrong, okay? They're going to claim stuff going back to 31 BCE, which is around the time of the death of Adam, which I don't doubt that they were people in Egypt at that time. I just doubt that they had Nephilim and all this stuff back in that time, okay? I also doubt that this is from that era, because when you look at the hairstyles and the faces and, you know, how they're depicted and all that stuff, this very much looks like post-flood Egypt stuff. And so the idea that this is where people are just going to defunct to the LXX and say, well, that has an older genealogy, therefore you can put all this stuff after flood. I don't buy that. You look at the images of the people in Sumer that are dated to the same range. They look extraordinarily different. Okay, not only are they different, they all look older. They're all wearing these big skirts that go down to their feet. Basically, they are tied up at their waist and go down to the feet. The Egyptians are wearing skirts that are just short skirts, and they seem to be more trendy. They also, the other people wear these big skirts that look like they were probably made of wool or something like that. And these guys look like they're wearing linen. I don't buy that these guys were wearing linen in 3100 BC. Linen comes from flax. It's a whole process. That would have been a more refined process. And you notice even their servants and slaves are wearing linen, right? I don't buy this. I don't buy that this is this old, okay? I think this stuff was probably created after the flood. But I do think this idea of these guys being these warrior kings, and the first one's going to be called a scorpion king, makes a lot of sense. Now remember, Jesus says that you're going to trample on serpents and scorpions. That's what he says to the believers in him, okay? Well, serpents are seraphs, which are basically the wicked angels. They're called seraphs, and seraphs was a term that meant flying serpent, burning serpent, or poisonous serpent, okay? Pretty good metaphor for the demons that whisper lies into your ears, okay? So these are wicked angels. They were also flying because they go back and forth between heaven and earth. So it's a pretty good symbol. The other ones are scorpions. Well, what's the difference between a scorpion? Well, they're a ground creature. They critter along the ground. They poison your heels with their stingers, so they're kind of like serpents in that way. So what might they represent? Well, if you understand, these are wicked angels and demons. Well, what are demons? They're the ghosts of Nephilim. Okay? So when he says you're going to trample on serpents and scorpions, he's literally referring to the wicked angels that travel between heaven and earth, bringing lies and testing the word of God and trying to steal what's sown, and the demons that try to possess people by taking over their bodies. And they're both poisonous. They're both attacking you with poison, and they're poisoning your body, but they're really just trying to take you over. Okay? So when he's saying you're going to trample on serpents and scorpions, I believe that's a veiled reference to the wicked angels and the Nephilim demons. Okay, well, who's their first king is known as the Scorpion King. Okay, You also have this early god known as Men, who has an erect phallus. The erect phalluses seem to be references to Nephilim and their fathers, because they were known for what comes from their genitalia is gods and, more powerful human beings and stuff like that. And so that's why you see these half human, half, you go all the way up to Göbekli Tepe up in Turkey, these half human, half animal creatures with erect phalluses has to do with Nephilim. It has to do with sex cults and stuff like this. And you're going to find stuff like this in cave paintings all around the world. This is some of the most ancient, common human religious motifs that we find in cave paintings and stuff are people with erect phalluses and half humans, half animals, and depictions of humans with animals sexually. Okay? Why do we have this? Because the fallen angels, a lot of them look like animals. We look at the angels depicted as bulls, lions, eagles, and then we see these Egyptian motifs of all these gods with people with bull heads, lion heads, and eagle heads, okay? And Montu is this guy who is depicted as black, but again, this could be painted on later. We don't know. This is probably not original. It was probably painted later, because again, these are carved into rocks and then painted after the fact, okay? And it was probably repainted again and again and again, but anyways, this is gods depicted in black. He has this crown. This is unique, this double sheaf crown, okay? So notice this is not the traditional red and white crown. You would have the red bowling pin there, and then you would have, or the white bowling pin, and then the red that goes back behind it. I believe those red and black crowns did not originally represent Upper and Lower Egypt. What I believe they originally represented was Cain and Abel, or Cain and Seth. The Sethites and the Cainites. And you have the Sethites, which is where the priesthood comes from. I don't want to keep looking at this direction here. We have the Sethites, who are the original priesthood. So the NCs and the Enkis and all these people come from the Sethites. And then we have the Cainites, who are the murdering warriors. Okay? Well, what it seems to be is the first guy who wears this double crown is their first king. But if you look at some of these old kings lists, remember how when we were looking at the Assyrians kings list, which is one of the oldest in the world, you're going to have, in the Assyrians kings list, you have Tudea and Adamu, okay, at the top. Well, why? That's Adam, and that is Utu of the heavens. Tudea is Utu of the heavens. It's the sun god. It's Yahweh, okay? So this is an order of authority. Who's in charge, okay? And Tudea, basically, he leaves. You don't have a reference to God interacting with them until Noah again, okay? And so it's like he's left Adam in charge for, 1,600 years. 1,500 years. He's gone. So Adam's in charge. Well, who are these guys after him? These are the people ruling the region of Assyria between Adam, and then you go Nu-Abu, father Noah, and surprise, there's about the same number of them as the number of people between Adam and Noah in the book of Genesis. Now, these are not the same people. These are the people that would have ruled the world or been the authority over Assyria between Utu and Noah. Okay? So you look at these people. Who are these guys? I don't know. I don't care. What these are is probably Sethites, maybe Cainites, who ruled over this area just west of the Tigris Valley between the death of Adam, so this is around 3100 BC, and the death of Noah, which is going to be around, I think it's around 1900 or 2000 BC. 2000 BC, roughly, okay? So you're talking about a period of 1100 years, and you're going to have 10 kings, and they're each ruling for about 100 years each. Well, why? Well, what's the difference between age between Adam and Seth? 130 years, okay? So what's the difference between their death? About a little between 100 and 120 years, okay? So you're going to have 10 kings. So when this guy dies, this guy's in charge. And then he's going to die 110 years later, then this guy's in charge. And he's going to die 110 years later, and then this guy's in charge. And you find the exact same pattern in Egypt, in Assyria, and in the Avestan, the old Avestan, which goes down to Faradun. It starts out with a guy named Geomar, who's a skin-clad first creation, and there's him, and then there's this, I forget what his name is, but it's essentially a sacred bull, and they say all the animals come from the one guy, and all the men come from the other guy, so there's their version of the bull of heaven. And then you have 10 people down, you have this Faradun who divides the earth between his 3 sons, okay? So there's their version of Adam to Noah, and again, you have about 10 kings between them, and they have long reigns, okay? So what you have here in Assyria is the people, Adam's in charge of the whole world, okay? Well, notice his name is Adamu. Well, what did the Egyptians call him? Atum, A-T-U-M, okay? Is it rocket science to think that that might be the same guy? It shouldn't be. Well, who's on top of Adam in their system? Ra. And then Ra gets merged with Adam, but you can look in the Book of the Dead, and it's very clear that Adam and Ra are different people. Now, you have different names for Adam, Ten, Aten, Atun, but it's all Adam. It's Adam. And then you have Ra, which is just their word for the sun. Okay, just like Utu is just the word for the sun. But when there's a symbol next to it, the symbol in Egypt next to Ra would be a mouth. The sun that speaks. Okay, this is really, really simple. I'm going to decode this for you without the Rosetta Stone. It's a mouth and a sun. It's the sun that speaks. It's the word of the Lord. Okay? So, this is really interesting. Later on, their high god is going to be, they're going to keep reorganizing their high god. And eventually they're going to make Osiris the sun god. Osiris is actually based on Dumuzid. He's the god of the underworld and the god of the dead to start out. He is exactly like Dumuzid. And just like you have Inanna going through these 7 layers of these 7 gates to get to Dumuzid, you have these 7 pylons that you have to get through to basically get to the good part of the afterlife, okay, with Osiris, okay? Well, they're eventually going to make Horus the top god and Osiris the top god, and what you're seeing here is all these different lands have different cults dedicated to different gods, and who's in charge and what priesthood is influencing them is going to determine which god gets put to the top of the pantheon. And what they're often going to do is merge these gods together. And the cool thing about Egypt is when we're studying Egypt is Egypt doesn't really get invaded by any outsiders until the Hyksos or the Hebrews, and they're not invaded. And then it's going to basically be the same people ruling until the Cushites take them over in the 8th century BCE. So you're talking about thousands of years of Egypt basically being ruled by the same people. Whereas in Mesopotamia, it keeps getting overthrown by the Gutians, by the Elamites, by the Chaldeans, by the Kassites. I mean, you're going to have half a dozen different people groups ruling Shinar or Sumer or the Eden area in the time that you're basically having the same people group ruling Egypt. Now, they do have 5 languages after the Tower of Babel, but it's not hard for them to. This is why all these gods are going to be pronounced different. Like you can just click on any one of these gods, and they're just like, Nephthys, and then just figure out that Nemti becomes Horus. So this is probably his pre-flood name, and the name means one who travels. Why does his name mean one who travels? He gets taken up to the sky. He's raptured. Okay, this is not rocket science, and he is considered the god of the ferrymen. Well, why? Because how is their main rapid source of travel? By ferries. The mythology of the river Styx and the whole being ferried by the boatman to the other side is going to be depicted as them crossing the Nile in a boat. So what they're doing is like, if you read in Romans 10, and this comes out of Deuteronomy, this whole idea like who will go over to the other side and get for us, that's what the original Deuteronomy states. And Paul is going to translate that in Romans 10 to who's going to descend to get the knowledge of how we get to heaven, basically. And he's going to say, nobody's going to ascend, nobody's going to descend. Christ came and gave it to us. This is the gospel, okay? So this is what he means in Romans 10. But if you go back and look at what he's citing in Deuteronomy, it's a reference to going to the other side of the sea. And that is based on this whole river Styx idea, which came out of Egypt. Remember, they're just coming out of Egypt when they're saying this. So the idea of the afterlife is going to the other side, or the other side of the sea. Remember, there's this deep chasm that is between the good side and the bad side of Sheol. Okay, and the idea of a deep chasm or a bottomless pit and a deep sea are kind of synonymous in their illustrations. Okay. So you've got this Nemti, and you've got the idea of, is this surprising that Enoch, the guy who gets raptured, is somebody who might be worshipped as somebody who will help you get to heaven? Shouldn't be. Or the good part of the afterlife? It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be confusing. The fact that it's a raptor depicting the guy who gets raptured, is that strange to you? It shouldn't be that strange, okay? So you have these guys named Min. This is probably their first Nephilim king, or maybe the demon that impregnated him. And he's the Scorpion King. And then Nemti, and then I think... Oh, and then the third one is going to be Set. Well, who's Set? It's going to be the deified Seth after he dies, okay? So it shouldn't be rocket science to figure out, well, whoever is their first Nephilim king is going to be a god. Whoever is based on Enoch is going to be a god. And whoever's based on Seth, which is where the priesthood comes from, is going to be a god, okay? Just like you have these Ns and these Ensees that rule over Sumer, you have these same people in Egypt, and they're just called gnomes. They rule over basically like an agrarian city-state, and you have a bunch of these up and down the Nile, and they're ruled by these gnomes. And these gnomes are basically going to be united under this first king who they call Narmer or Menes, and people think because it begins with an M, it's Mizraim. And I'm going to say no, Menes is Min. Menes is Min. This is just literally the Hellenized version of Min. The Greeks always end male gods with an S, okay? So they call Min Menes, okay? Well, the pre-flood name, and this shouldn't be shocking, because you have all these people whose names end with a U at the end of their name out of Sumerian, which is probably related to the pre-flood language. Well, you have this guy named Mantu, who is this war god. And so when you look at the Turin's Kings list, and you go all the way up to the top of this thing, you have these gods. And what this is going to be written around the time of Ramses II. So this is going to be the pharaoh that rules around the time that the Jews are basically in the book of Judges, okay? And you have Ra at the top, just like you have Tudia at the top. And then you have these guys, Shu and Geb. And we're going to get into why I think these are a merger of Adam and Eve and basically Yahweh and the word of the Lord and the Spirit of the Lord. And then after them, you have Osiris, Set, and Horus, which is basically Abel, Seth, and Enoch. And then you have Thoth, Ma'at, and this Heraris, where people think might be another version of Horus or Hero. But there's a third person with them, and these seem to be the people who invent writing and the laws of Egypt. So these are probably pre-flood people who invented. That's why they're famous alongside Osiris, Source, and Set, which is Seth, Enoch, and Abel. Shouldn't be rocket science. Again, these are Sethites who have moved over and established this colony in Egypt because of the warfare that's going on in Adam's region. It was probably a small farming colony to begin with, but it became a major center for them because they're constantly fighting over Eden until the world's destroyed by the flood. Then you're going to have a list of these other gods, and Hab is, I don't know what that Ibis is, but the Apis bull comes from Hepu, and he's believed to be a reincarnation of Ptah. Ptah becomes the top of the gods list, and he is associated with Hephaestus. Ptah and Hephaestus are the same guy, who seems to be Tubal-Cain, because he's associated with metalcraft, basically, okay? This god becomes the architect of the universe. So your Freemason or whatever architect of the universe, your demiurge, is literally Ptah, which is Tubal-Cain, okay? Well, why is the name Ptah there? And the answer is simple. The way the Egyptians would symbolize God breathing life into Adam and Eve, we're going to get into this in a second because they're going to merge this guy with Canaan, is that he spit it into them. So, remember, he breathes life into their nostrils. This is the whole idea of Jesus spitting in the clay and fixing the guy's eyes. The idea, this ancient idea, is that God used his spit to turn the earth into mud and then mold Adam's shape, and then he breathed life into them, okay? Well, how would you verbalize spitting? Ptah, right? Ptah, okay? So when Ptah, this Tubal-Cain god, gets moved to the top of the hierarchy, and he's going to have different names, his name becomes Ptah, the one who spits, okay? the whole idea of the gods spitting is ptah, okay? And then eventually, somehow the Greeks are going to get their gods from the Egyptians and the Danites. It seems to. They all come from the Danites, the Phoenicians, the Sidonians, and the Egyptians. The Greeks don't have any original gods, okay? They're all going to come from the ancient Near East. Hapu is going to be the Apis bull, who they believe is the incarnation of Ptah, and he's going to be a trinity. He's going to be the Apis bull, so the bull of heaven, merged with a sun disk over his head. So there's Ra, merged with a serpent coming out of his forehead, and that's going to be their Urias, which is basically a serpent of wisdom, which is based on the same Ouroboros, okay? Shemsu, name means follower. I wouldn't be shocked if this is Shem. Remember, this is going to be around the time of the Hebrew book of Judges, and these are their lists of God. You see Horus in here again. Who these gods are, I don't know. These are inscriptions, and you can see with the ... that means they can't read what it is, okay? But what they believe is you have these gods, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This is called the Ennead. These are their high gods, if you will. And why are there 9 of them? Why are they concocting a list of 9 high gods? The answer is simple. Because in this place called Chemnu, and Chemnu, it's Khemnu, okay? Remember, Ham is spelled by the Egyptians with a Cham, so it's like a Cham, okay? They didn't have a K in their language. This is phoneticized after the face. So it's like a guttural Kham. Chemnu is Noah, Ham of Noah, Ham the son of Noah, okay? Chemnu is a city based on Ham, the son of Noah. And in there, you're going to have the Ogdoad. And the Ogdoad is Nu, there's Noah, Ammon, there's Ham, and Che and Kek. Che and Kek represent, one represents expanse. Okay, so remember how Japheth, he said, would expand, okay? He's going to increase Japheth, okay? So Che means expanse. Kek means something like secrets or like hidden or initiated or something like that, okay? Well, what was Enoch's name meaning in Hebrew? Initiated. Well, who was the Enki, in other words, the priest of the earth, after him? Shem. So you have the one who's expanding, the initiated one, and Ammon that becomes their word for their creator god. And you're going to see Ammon start to appear in their king's names after that. This is literally Noah, Japheth, Shem, and Ham. Is that shocking? And then their wives, you see the ET at the end. It's just the same name with the ET at the end, okay? This is something that the Hebrews do. Remember, the Hebrews are going to co-rule with the Egyptians. And these other guys who are, these Nemti, Set, and Min, are worshipped in this place called Kift or Koft or Copt. This is where the Coptics get their name from. This is where Kaftor, remember the Philistines come from Kaftor, gets its name from, and Crete by the Egyptians was called Kaft, okay? These seem to be the Egyptians who the Hebrews co-rule with. Remember, there's like 7 tribes of Egyptians. So if you go to Genesis 10, you go to the sons of Mizraim, there's Cush, there's Mizraim, the Ludim, Ananim, Lebahem, Naphtudim, Pathruhim, Calsuhim. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, out of whom came the Philistine and the Caphtorim. So there's 7 tribes of Egyptians, which means there's 7 different languages of the Egyptians, okay? This is why there's so much confusion with their gods, okay? And then the Philistines come out of them, so that means the Bible says he drew them out of Kaftor, which Kaftor seems to be an ancient name for Egypt, but the Jews are generally going to call it Mizraim. The Hamites, or the ancient name, the Egyptians themselves called it Chemet. Chemet. Well, if Et is the wife of Chem, it's the wife of Ham. Why? Probably because Ham buried his wife there. That's probably why. Ham is going to end up probably marrying a second wife who is going to be either a daughter of Heber or a daughter of Shem. But it's probably going to be Heber because he's going to be older. And this is why you're going to find Ham dwelling in this town called I think it's called Gedor or something like that, which is literally between Bethlehem and Hebron. It's like right off the side on the road to Bethlehem and Hebron. Well, he's probably married in with a daughter of Heber as a second wife, and it's around that time when he seems to start getting into digging up all the old artifacts and teaching Canaan how to remember these things. So Canaan is going to be represented in Egypt too as this guy named Canaan. So you're going to find Canaan. You're going to find between Hebrew and Egyptian, both ways, N's and M's at the end of words get mixed up. Okay? Remember, they're two different languages, but they were heavily influenced by each other because they lived with each other for hundreds of years after the Tower of Babel. Okay? So you're going to find a lot of similarities in suffixes and word formation and stuff like that between Egyptian and Hebrew, because you want to think of them as like two dialects, creoles, that are influenced by each other. They're going to have similar words. For instance, the Mitanni, the people in the Mitanni kingdom, okay? The Mitanni kingdom, people are like, we don't know who these Mitanni are. It's really simple. The Mitanni seems to mean the community or the United Kingdom or something along those lines, okay? And the Egyptians call them Matani Naharim. Matani Naharim, okay? Well, the Egyptians called them Aram Naharim, okay? Why? Well, the Hebrews, or the name to the Egyptians, Matani, seems to signify marriage alliances, okay? This is the whole United Kingdom community, okay? Well, why? Because that's where the Hebrews are going to get their wives. This is very well documented. The Hebrews, Abraham's comes from there. His brother Haran lives there. Or I'm sorry, the city of Haran is named after his older brother, and then his older brother Nahor lives there. Okay, Nahor means river because probably he was born on a river, and the river's named after him. And Naharim does mean the two rivers because Nahar or Nahor means river, but the Naharim are also the descendants of Nahor. So when they call that, when the Hebrews call them Aram Naharim, they're literally the descendants of Nahor mixed with the Arameans. That's why they're called Aram Naharim. But it can also mean Naram between the rivers because it's plural for rivers. Aram Naharim is basically the descendants of Nahor, Abraham's brother, and then they're getting their wives from there. So the Mitanni is this united, this community of unity, which is the Hebrews. Remember, for 150 years, they're going to be peaceful with the Hebrews, and they're going to rule all the way up here to Carchemish. This Carchemish is an Egyptian city, and this Byblos is an Egyptian city. So what's going on here? Well, this Katna and Kadesh and Amar and Ugarit, these are all Amorite cities. These are Canaanite cities. But the Jews are going to establish Byblos and Carchemish as a way to bypass all these guys in these lowlands here and hook up with their relatives. Notice there's Haran right here. Here's Mitanni, and their language is called Hurrian. And the language seems to be Japhethite, just like the Hittite language is Luwian, and it seems to be Japhethite. Well, this is simple. One of the descendants of Shem is called Lud in the Bible, and so the Hittites seem to have a hard time pronouncing hard vowel sounds in the midst of words, and so they're going to have a lot of L's and W's in the middle. So Lud and Luwian is basically the same thing. But the peoples around there, even though Lud is Semitic, the peoples around there are mostly Japhethites. And so it ends up being like a Japhethite Creole, which they call Luwian. Well, the people of are the people who came up to Haran with Abraham and his family, and then Nahor ended up being the one who stayed there, okay? So you have these people from and this language is mostly Japhethite because the surrounding, most of the people are Japhethites around here. This is Lake Van. This is up near where the Ark is. And you see this whole area. This is the Ararat region. This is where the Ark is. And so this is where the Japhethites are. And they're going to be mixed in with these people. But the language, but the main core people group are from So the language is called Urian or Hurrian, okay? And you just so happen to have Hurrian and then a place called Haran and then Nahor living up there. And so you have these Mitanni people who speak the Urian language who are known to the Egyptians as the Mitanni Naharim. It's the people of Nahor that they co-marry with. Okay? So these are all based on the Jews and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their heirs in Egypt while they're still free going up here to get their wives. It's after that when Egypt starts to go to war with the Hittites, after they enslave the Jews. No, I'm sorry. I don't think it's after they enslaved the Jews. Like, we know from the book of Chronicles that I believe it was Philistines or it might have been Canaanites kill the sons of Ephraim when they're shepherding here. The Jews are living up here, and the area around Hebron seems to be called Har Yaakov, the mountain of Jacob. Okay? So they don't see, the Jebusites seem to be right up in Jerusalem. But Hebron, which is also a mountainous area, they had this stronghold there, which is there from the days of Abraham, and it was probably where Heber was centralized. And Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all inherit this land, okay? And so it's called Har Yaakov, which is the mountain of Jacob. And you're going to have Joseph ruling, and Jacob is ruling Canaan for the last 17 years of his life. They go into Egypt to survive the famine, but remember, the famine's just 7 years, and Jacob's going to live 17 years after that. And by the time he dies, he talks about this land that he took away from the Amorites with his sword and his bow, which is the land of the Golan region, which is he's going to give to the Manassites. This is why you have the Judites and the Manassites in the region until the Jews are sold into captivity, and then the Amorites under Og, king of Bashan, come back here and take over. So we know we have Jews fighting with Amorites in the days of Jacob, and so surprise, these are all Amorite cities, and so with the Egyptians, they're going to establish Byblos as a port, so they don't have to go through all the mountainous regions of the Canaanites and get raided, and then they're going to be able to establish that with caravans that just go up to Carchemish, which is on the other side of the region, surrounded by Haran, and that's where they're going to trade with their people, and out of that trade, they're going to bring into Egypt the sickle sword, the chariot, and horses, which is going to make Egypt the most powerful empire in the world. They're also going to, because remember, they're going from from Byblos to Avaris, they're also going to colonize Cyprus and Crete with the Egyptians. Also with the Egyptians, the Danites are going to establish Thebes in Greece. Remember that the Egyptians they co-rule with, they rule at Thebes in Egypt, and they're going to establish a Thebes in Greece. They're going to establish Knossos in Crete. They're going to establish Argos in the Peloponnese, and they're going to establish Mycenae. Those are all Danite Egyptian cities that the Danites are going to come back and take over, and that becomes the Achaeans. Okay, that becomes the Greeks that overthrow Troy and all that stuff. Okay, but back to this Ogdoad. When you get to this Ogdoad, this is basically Noah, Japheth, Shem, and Ham, and their wives. That's who that is. Okay. And that's, you see Ham at the bottom because he's the youngest, right? Japheth is the oldest. This fits. The one whose name means expanse is Japheth. The one whose name means kind of the initiated into the secrets, which is Melchizedek, that is Shem. And the Egyptians are all about secrets. See, here's the secret. God's religion was never secret. Love God, love people, God's going to send a savior. That's the religion. That's all it was. But the Egyptians are going to make it secretified because they're going to absorb these lies from the serpent, basically, in the belief that the serpent is the source of all wisdom, and everything is about a secret meaning, and everything is about gods really being other gods in disguise, and all this stuff that is going to lead to trying to figure out the secrets of the mysteries of eternal life. The Egyptians are obsessed with this, okay? Notice some of their gods. Kek and Kaukat. This is a serpent and a frog, okay? So you can tell that they had these demonic kind of manifestations. Nu literally has to do with the flood, and people are like, "Oh, that's the flooding of the Nile." No, it's not. It's Noah. It's Noah and his flood. Okay, this is not rocket science. But when you find the depiction of these guys, watch this. Nu, or also known as Nun, is depicted in this relief 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and he's the 8th in a boat. Why? Who's above? This is a scarab. Why is the scarab important to the Egyptians? Simple. Yahweh, who they're going to call Atum or Ra, is not, and Aten could be like a transliteration of Utu. It literally could be a translation of Utu that becomes merged with Adam as Atum, okay? Ra just means the sun. And the scarab beetle, also known as the dung beetle, is going to roll a ball of poop across the sand. So the Egyptians would observe them rolling a ball of poop across the sand, and they would say, that's like this god that during the daytime pushes the sun across the earth and then comes down the cool of evening, and he knows whether we've been bad or good, so be good for goodness sake. Okay? And so the scarab becomes symbolic for the god that pushes the sun across the sky. It's a symbol that means Yahweh, or Utu, or Ra. And then it's understood that he's the god of the sun, the speaking sun, if you will, because he is the light that pre-existed the sun. Okay? So he's before the sun. So he pushes the sun across the sky, and you understand, let there be light. There was day and night, and there was light before there was a sun created in the fourth day. And so you're going to have this guy who represents the word of the sun. Okay? He's the word of the Lord. And then you're going to have these 8 people in a boat. Noah is the guy carrying the boat because he's the one who built the boat. And that's why he's carrying the boat instead of in the boat. But this is representing Noah and the 8. Okay? His name is new. This is not rocket science, you guys. This is not like, gee, I wonder where this came from. This is like, if you don't have an anti-biblical bias, this is not rocket science. If you look at the sun god in Utu, gee, I wonder where this came from. If you don't have an anti-biblical bias and you understand that Genesis 1 through 9 was an oral tradition that everybody had, this is why Moses isn't giving you all these extra details on it. Because Yahweh obviously isn't giving them extra details on it, and this is all they have. This is it. This is what everybody knows from before the flood. So, you have these people living in Keft, these early gods in Keft, which is where the Copts are, which Moses says are the Caphtorim, okay? So what does this tell you? It tells you most of these god systems didn't emerge until after the flood. The Sethites didn't seem to worship these people as God, but they did commemorate famous people like Seth, like Enoch, like their first Nephilim king. And of course, the idea that you have this guy depicted as a giant, if he's a Nephilim, should not be rocket science, okay? Now notice he's a giant holding a rod. There was a thing that was with these giants that their erection signified whether or not their confidence and the confidence of this god and whether or not they'd have a good harvest and things would be beneficial for them. It was an early form of divination among them. Why? Because they're obsessed with sex cults. And these Nephilim seem to be very lustful and would rape and pillage, basically. So they become these kings of all these societies. So it's possible that Dagon might have been a Nephilim. It's possible that some of these Lugals in Sumer might have been Nephilim, although the Lugals seem to be more on the Canaanite side, and the Nephilim seem to be more on the Sethite side. What it seems to be is the Canaanites get to metal weapons first, and the Sethites, as a counter to that, start producing Nephilim first, which is basically a corruption of the seed of the serpent, or the seed of the woman promise. And they're actually making seed of the serpents, because these are the sons of seraphs, basically. So they're seeds of the serpents, just pretending to be seeds of seed of the woman. And surprise, they're giants depicted as ruling over these people. And what are these? These are standards, probably marching to war or signifying rallying the people. Then you have these weird dinosaur-looking creatures. What are these things? They kind of look like they have lion heads, but they're probably like brontosauruses or something like that. And then you have a guy being trampled by a bull. That could be the bull of heaven. And I'm sure an Egyptologist is probably going to be like, you're an idiot. It means this, this, and this. This is probably representing Enoch or Horus or Nephthys, this early god. And then you have this guy beating a servant. So they're enslaving their captives or whatever, okay? But notice you have both Egyptian crowns from the beginning. Well, Atum wears both crowns. Why? Because Adam is the ruler over, and what I believe this represents right here, the Canaanites and the Sethites. That's what I believe it represents. If this is that old, if this is pre-flood dated, and again, I'm going by the Masoretic text, I'm sticking to it because everything else seems to line up to it, this would probably be a representation of the wars between the Canaanites and the Sethites. That's what I would expect. One is a white crown, one is a red crown, and Atum wears both crowns. Now, these are eventually going to be called the crowns of Ra and Amen. They're god of the earth. He's considered a creator god, and then Ra, the god of heaven. Okay? The merger of these two things. What these also could represent is the human leader and the Nephilim leader. But the point is, there's two different rules, and Atum had the rule over both. And this is why there's a big deal when the Egyptians get unified and they have a king who wears the double crown. And this double crown is going to be prominent forever. Okay, people think the Pope's crown is designed on this. It's the idea that he's ruling over both worlds. Well, that rule over both worlds was probably originally Adam. And when he dies, those two worlds split and start fighting each other. And so the idea of somebody who's going to rule over both is a big deal. And this is what your Egyptologists are going to say. These gods that they're telling us are not represented as ruling over Egypt. They're represented as ruling over the world. And they're going to say because these people were stupid and they thought Egypt was the whole world. This is so dumb because these guys literally have lapis lazuli all over their stuff, which everyone knows comes from Afghanistan. So they're obviously trading all the way to Afghanistan before and after the flood, which means they're trading with India, which traded with Afghanistan, and they're trading with Sumer. They have no reference to Sumer. They have no reference to Akkad, which means the stuff is probably not as old as you think. And some of it that maybe is still dealing with, we know we have reference, we have cities that were in Afghanistan that seem to be pretty advanced in terms of metallurgical craft. They seem to have pottery that is similar to the Ubaid pottery. And then we have seem to be a pre-flood civilization in the Indus Valley that gets recolonized by the Hamites afterwards. So you have Egypt, Arabia, the mountains of Canaan, Sumer, and then India basically being recolonized by the Hamites, probably all before Ham is dead. So you're talking about in a period of 500 years. It's plenty of time. And what they're doing is they're digging up the pre-flood stuff, and then they're taking the famous people from the pre-flood, and they're consolidating them into pantheons of gods. But what they start out doing is they find these different cults to these different people, which were probably just commemorative. Remember, these people lived to be 1,000 years old, with the exception of Enoch, which means those people were probably there at one point in time, and that was their actual house. And it turns out in Sumer, the same word for house is the same word for temple. So when you look at something that's like, oh, that's the house of Seth, Seth probably literally lived there he could have lived there for 300 years. And that was his house. And it's a big house because he's a famous guy with lots of kids, and he has his family over. And then he dies, and his house is there, and he has houses here, here, and here because he's the patriarch of 1 million people. And when he comes into town, he stays in his house, and lots of people come over and visit him, so he has a big house. And then when he dies, they set up a monument to him there. Why? That was Seth's house. That's where he lived. And next thing you know, it becomes the temple of Seth because people are offering incense there and putting cookies there and stuff like that, thinking he eats them in the afterlife because he's on the other side. And next thing you know, it turns into a temple and a cult. This is not rocket science, because we see Christians doing that with the saints by the days of Augustine. 300 years. I mean, this is like 100 years after they stopped persecuting Christians. They're doing the exact same thing with the martyred saints that the people before were doing with their ancestors. It's not rocket science. The people in China still do this today. They set up a shrine in the house. Whoever is the heir of the house keeps that shrine, and then the other relatives, when they come visit the house, they put a little candle of incense to honor their ancestors. This is something that's all over China and Southeast Asia. They do it to the Buddha in a lot of places now, okay? So you have famous men like the Buddha, and then you have ancestors they're doing it with. Where does this come from? It comes from Sumer. The Chinese are the people of Shinar, okay? So they're all doing the same thing, which is basically honor your ancestors, and that turns into worship your ancestors, and that turns into your ancestors are God. especially when you get to the point where everyone's languages are confused and people are now living to be 70 and they used to live to be 1,000. And when you study the gods of all these ancient peoples and you read what they say about them, it is very clear that they believe their gods can die and decompose. See, this is not what we've been taught in the modern era. We've been taught that God means immortal beings that never die. It never meant that in the ancient world. Never meant that. It meant they live a very long time. So when you see in the modern Thor and Loki and these gods in these Marvel movies how they're really old, but they can die, that was what the ancients believed about the gods. Why do they believe this? This is really simple. Because they were told when they eat the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, they will be like gods. And then when Yahweh comes down, he says, in the presence of Adam and Eve, they have become like one of us. And there's only 4 people present when he does this. There's the serpent, Adam, Eve, and Yahweh. So if he says they become like one of us, and nobody's understanding that Satan is a demon, you got to remember the angels were called Elohim, gods. And the angel of the Lord, even though he is the Son of God and he always existed, he's eternal, he's not created like Satan is, they're both Elohim. So he says they become like one of us, like one of what? Elohim, knowing good and evil. They become like one of us. Okay? So the people say the ancients were God. They became like one of them. But what happened? They got degraded over time. Why? Well, the Bible says why. The Spirit says, I'm not going to strive with men forever. In other words, the Spirit is saying, I'm not going to keep men alive forever because they're flesh and they're wicked, and I'm not just going to keep exerting energy to keep them alive, to keep getting more and more wicked. Their days will be 120 years. And what you find is after that, the days diminish down to 120 years. To the maximum, the oldest person alive, you look at it at any given time, they're almost always under 100 years. In a rare case, they might go over by a year or two. Okay? That's the oldest person alive. Most people live to be 70 or 80, but Moses, who wrote that, was 120. Okay? So the oldest people alive are always going to be, let's look at the oldest person alive right now. Oldest person alive, 112 years. The oldest living person in the world whose age has been validated is Ethel Carterham, who has lived 115 years. She's still alive. She's going into her 116th year. And you can go through all of history, look up the oldest person alive, and it's always somebody who seems to attain just shy of 120 years. In an extremely rare case, they might go over by a year or two, okay? Why? Because the Holy Spirit said you're going to limit man's age to 120 years, and most people are going to live 70 or 80 if by strength. You look at the average human age. Average human age, 72 years. With all our advances in medical science, everything is exactly like Moses said it was in Genesis 6 and in Psalm 90. From then to today. And you can go look and you can go find the wisest guy in Greece here might have lived to be 90 years old. Polycarp lives to be like 90 years old. You know, you're going to have people who are considered to be the wisest and most preeminent person alive, and they're going to live to be something like 90 years old. And occasionally you're going to have a person that lives to be over 100. But from the time of Moses, the oldest person alive is 120. I think Solomon dies in his 50s. No, he lives to be 40 years old. Yeah, he dies in his 50s, possibly 60s. David dies in his 70s. Okay? So, with all advances in medical science, the average life expectancy on the earth is 72 years. Average human age in Okinawa, which is where the healthiest people on the earth are, because they eat fish and seaweed and kelp, and they get mist over them, and they're highly oxygenated because they're low to the ocean. They have all the best circumstances. Look at this. The women reach 87. The men reach 80. 70, 80 if by strength. They have the best circumstances in the world, diet-wise, health-wise, environment-wise, and they reach 80. The women reach 87 because they don't have to work as hard as the men. Nothing's changed. So when these people are watching their ages, no matter how hard they try to take care of their health, diminishing. And then these Hebrews get there. And these Hebrews are still living to be 120 while they're living to be 70. What the heck? And then Jacob shows up, who lives to be 147, and he says, when the Pharaoh asks him how old he is, he says, I've just lived to be a measly 147 years old. I haven't attained to the days of my fathers, because Abraham and Isaac lived to be 180 and 175. And he just lived to be a measly 147. And these Egyptians who are living to be like 70 by this time are like, what the heck? You guys must be part God. And so when you go to Herodotus' histories, and he is questioning, Herodotus is writing during the Peloponnesian Wars. So these are the wars between the Greeks and the Persians while the Persians are dominant. So you're talking 6th century BC. He is writing that he has traveled to Phoenicia and Egypt and stuff like this, and he's researched all their gods, and they say their oldest sets of gods are a set of 8 gods and a set of 12 gods. And I'm going to tell you who the 8 gods are. That's the Ogdoad, and the 12 gods are probably the Hebrews. I haven't found another set of 12 gods in Egypt, and they're probably the Hebrews, and that makes a lot of sense, because remember, most of these pantheons, and the Book of the Dead comes from the era where they overthrew the Hebrews. The Turin Kings list comes from Ramses II, which is when the Hebrews are now in the Promised Land. This is about 100 years before King Saul. So the Egyptians are in their New Kingdom phase. They're very anti-Hyksos and Hebrews, even though they're going to marry into them in the days of Solomon. But here, they have been decimated, and they've been going into decline ever since then. So the Egyptians are known for a race and guys they don't like. Akhenaten is going to try to reinvigorate a monotheistic state based on just the worship of Aten or Ra, which is basically the sun god Utu. It's basically Yahweh to them. Okay, I'm not saying it is, I'm saying to them it is. Okay? And all this decline happens after they mistreat these 12 guys who came into Egypt and made them the most powerful empire in the world. And then they enslave their kids, and then they get destroyed by this god. And they have this legend called the night of mourning, where based on their legend, these women who are called the descendants of Hercules, the daughters of Hercules, are called the Danids. And the Danids, these are female Danites, the Danids are supposedly murdered all their husbands. This is not the murdering of all their husbands. This is a later Egyptian corruption of what was God killing all the firstborn. And it's one of their oldest mysteries, Herodotus said, and I can't even talk about it because it's so sacred to them, but it's this night of mourning when all their princes die. Why? Because all their firstborn died. That's what they're mourning. So, fast forward to the post-flood era. Remember, Ham and Canaan seem to be the guys who go after these ancient artifacts and digging up the stuff and interpreting the Egyptian hieroglyphs from before the flood, if there were any, and the Sumerian text from before the flood, okay? It shouldn't be shocking that Egypt has no record of Sumer, because the Egyptians write in hieroglyphics, and Sumer would have been prominent before. It would have been under the dominion of Akkad when Egypt started getting big, but it was before the Tower of Babel, and most of what we have from Egyptian records come from the period of the Jews and Egypt's being friendly with each other to the time of Israel rising as a nation. That's most of what we have from Egypt. We have stuff that comes after that, but I'm saying the most ancient stuff we have is from that era. And that in that era, the Sumerians would have vanished, and I believe have become the Mesoamericans. Okay? So you're going to have these reigns of these gods who are in authority, which I'm going to suggest to you are, here's Ra, Shu, and Geb, and this is why. Shu is emptiness, he who rises up, and the Egyptians seem to be merging gods, humans, and primordial concepts. And this is really simple. What was their first, second, and third? And they seem to be doing stuff related on a version of Genesis 1 and 2 that suggests that one is the spiritual version and one is the physical version, okay? So you literally have Aten and Ra, Adam and Yahweh, merged together. Aten Ra, okay? And then you have Shu, which means emptiness. Okay, well, what's the second thing? The formless and void, okay? And then it also means he who rises up, okay? So that's Adam. So they're merging the one who, the formless and void. Because remember, there's going to be the void and then the earth. Well, the earth is Adama, and Adam is made of the earth, okay? So they're going to look at these as the spiritual and physical concepts of each other, okay? So the one who rises up out of the earth is Adam. The void is, so this is basically the void in the earth. And then he's going to have a sister goddess, which is Tefnut, which is associated with the sun somehow in a lion head. And the other one is the air god. And then this is Shu, and this is going to be, I believe, Shu's connection with the air, and it says Adam spits her out. These are versions of the creation myth. Ptah, he spits her out, right? This is why Ptah is going to be placed over the Godhead eventually, and then she's associated with water. Okay? Well, if you remember, the Holy Spirit, which is a feminine, lights upon the water. Okay? So the heaven, the earth, and then the Spirit lights upon the water. Okay? But when you have Adam and Eve, because in the creation order is going to be the Spirit, which is associated with the wind, followed by let there be light, which is the word of the Lord, which is associated with the sun. But in the Genesis 2, you have man created before woman. So what they do is they have the sun, then man, then woman, in that order. But they also seem to have the light, the void, and then the water in that order. So they're literally taking Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and they're merging them together and saying this is the physical and this is the spiritual primordial. They're just taking the ideas and merging them together, okay? And again, this stuff is probably going to happen under Canaan. And what they're doing is they're looking at hieroglyphs that depict the same thing that Noah would have said in Genesis 1. And they're saying this is the secret meaning of it. And this is how they start going into darkness. And who leads them into this darkness? This guy named, bear with me, Canaan. When you get to, we start talking about who this mysterious Canaan is of Luke 3 that is not in the Masoretic of Genesis or in the Chronicles 1. He is not in the Samaritan Pentateuch of Genesis 5 or Chronicles 1. He is in the LXX version of Genesis 5, but not in 1 Chronicles. And then he's in Luke 3. Canaan, the son of Arphaxad. Why? In the book of Jubilees, remember I told you how the Egyptians and the Hebrews are going to mix up N's and M's at the end of their word. And you can just go look at stuff, and I don't care if it's like a plural, like the Denyen. The Hebrews say Danyim. The Egyptians say Denyem for the Danites. Okay? Canaan is Canaan. So if you look at the book of Jubilees, who they say his name, the son of Arphaxad is, it's Canaan. Canaan, not Canaan, okay? K-A-I-N-A-M, okay? Now compare that to Canaan. It's almost the exact same word, okay? Now this is important because where he is worshipped is on Elephantine Island, which if you know what's important about Elephantine Island is that the Jews had a temple there after Jerusalem was destroyed. They had a temple on the same island where Canaan is worshipped, okay? And all of a sudden, you have this book of Jubilees appearing, which people are claiming was written by Jewish priests, the true priesthood, they would say. And they have the Aaronic priesthood going all the way back to Jacob. They're claiming that Jacob made Levi a priest before Moses made Aaron a priest. And that is not true, but they're trying to make their priesthood more ancient to match with the Egyptians and act like the Jews had a priesthood in Egypt. Well, the Jews did have a priesthood in Egypt because remember, Joseph was the son-in-law to the priest at On, which is where Ra was worshipped. And Joseph was known to have divination powers. So who do you think takes over the priesthood of Ra after his father-in-law dies? Probably Joseph and his descendants. That was the priesthood, okay? And we read stuff in the prophets about how the Jews were idolaters in Egypt, okay? They became idolaters. Joseph was letting people believe that he had a cup of wine that he used for divination, right in the Bible. So just because it's Joseph doesn't mean he's not doing anything wrong. He's lying to his brothers. He's playing tricks on his brothers. And then he is lying to the Egyptians. And even though God is giving him stuff by the Holy Spirit, he is letting them believe that there is a cup that he uses for divination. And that's why when Benjamin takes that cup, he's like, he stole the cup that he uses for divination. Well, who's telling him that? Joseph is. So he's in with the priesthood, and he is not the most honest dude. Okay? So what are they doing? They're taking over the Egyptian priesthood, and they're becoming the prime ministers. And so you have Ra worship, and by the time you get to the Book of the Dead, this is like 150 years later, you're going to find all this stuff in there that's saying the Ra that we worship is not really Ra. It's not the real Ra. It's Atum. So apparently the idea of calling Ra Atum, which is similar to Utu, which is where the Hebrews come from, they say came from these kings of the East. These invaders from the East. And they worship Set, who is the storm god, because Yahweh appeared in the storm. So who are they using in the Hebrew mysteries? The storm god and the sun god. The same people the Mesoamericans say is the sun god that becomes a storm god. The Jews are saying, well, where did they come from? The same place the Mesoamericans came from, Sumer. Abraham came from Ur. They don't know the name Yahweh. Nobody knows the name Yahweh, and so they have their legends and their myths and their mysteries about who God is and what he's called. But they're referring to him as the God of Seth, which is why the name Set becomes famous. And then Yahweh is going to distinguish himself to Moses as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because their ancestor Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob heard from God. He is making clear that he is the God that interacted with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, so it's different than saying the God of Seth, because the God of Seth didn't interact with anybody. They would say that the God of Seth interacted with, they were a priesthood to him, so they were offering up sacrifices to him, but he interacted with Enoch, he interacted with Adam, and he interacted with Noah, and that's pretty much it. But Abraham and Isaac and Jacob had interactions with a God. And so Yahweh is making sure they understand that's him. That's why he says, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the word Yahweh seems to depict something along the lines of he is. So he's the I am, okay? He's the eternal one. Well, the Egyptians worship Canaan. He is one of their oldest gods, because Canaan is going to be one of the first guys who gets deified after the flood, who they worship. And Canaan, or Canaan, is known as the god who has a potter's wheel and makes people out of potter's clay and breathes Ka into them, or puts Ka into them. Well, where are they getting this? They're merging Canaan with Yahweh from Genesis 2. He makes man out of clay, and then he breathes the breath of life into them. Okay? This is important because the Bible refers to Yahweh as the potter, and they are the clay. And what prophets do this? Isaiah and Jeremiah. And both Isaiah and Jeremiah also have condemnations against Egypt, because in both cases, with the Assyrians and with the Babylonians, the Israelites are going to the Egyptians seeking their aid against the invading Assyrians and Babylonians. The Egyptians are going to try and fight the Egyptians are going to be overthrown by the Assyrians, and they're going to be replaced with the Cushites. The Egyptians are going to be invaded by the Babylonians, but they're not going to be taken over by them. But the Hebrews are going to go into Egypt. They're going to start burning, offering up cakes to the Queen of Heaven, which is Isis, based on Inanna. And they're going to start mourning for Tammuz, which is Osiris, based on Dumuzi. This is what the Hebrews are doing in the book of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is going to curse those in the name of God. He's going to curse those Jews for doing this. Because here's why. After Babylon is destroyed, they have a descendant of the house of David murder Gedaliah, who is basically the Babylonian. He's a Jew he's basically like a administrator from the house of David, who the Babylonians put in charge after they sacked Jerusalem. And then a guy from the line of David goes and kills him. And the Jews that are still there are just like, what do we do? Nebuchadnezzar's going to come back here and kill all of us when they find out we killed the guy that he appointed. And they go to Jeremiah and they say, Jeremiah, what should we do? We will do whatever the Lord tells us to do, because Jeremiah's been right on everything, okay? So Jeremiah says to them, stay here, don't fear Nebuchadnezzar, just submit to him. But don't go into Egypt, because otherwise it's going to look like you're guilty. And he's saying, don't do that, because the guy who kills him, he's going to run off and hide among the Nabateans, I believe it is. So he's saying, don't go run into Egypt. That's going to make you look guilty. He's saying, stay here and submit to Nebuchadnezzar, okay? And he says, but if you go into Egypt, you're going to be pursued with the sword and all that stuff. Well, the people, after coming to him and saying, inquire for the Lord for us, because remember, Jeremiah is a priest and a prophet, okay? They're going to say, you're lying, and they're going to go into Egypt anyways. So what God is going to say in response to that is that you guys are cursed. Unless you come back to Israel, you are cursed. And he says, and if you ever invoke my name again, I am going to pursue you with the sword, with death, with a curse. Okay? Those Jews do not come back. Those Jews stay in Egypt. They're ultimately going to have a priesthood on Elephantine Island. They're going to be in Sais when Pythagoras comes through, and they're going to influence him. And this is by their own testimony. They're saying they influenced Pythagoras, who influenced Plato. Okay? And then they're going to be all over Alexandria, Egypt, and they're going to be the fountainhead of Gnosticism. These Jews are going to create Jewish Gnosticism before there's any Christians. Philo of Alexandria is effectively one of them. Okay? He's related to the Sadducees, related to the royal family, but he's of Jews who are staying in Israelites. The Book of Wisdom, which calls wisdom the Holy Spirit and a created being, is created in Alexandria, Egypt. Several of the apocryphal books seem to come from Alexandria, Egypt. And then Gnosticism comes from Alexandria, Egypt. And then all the corruptions that become the Essenes there in Alexandria. The cults that basically become the monastic movement, which is where all the Egyptian mysteries are kept throughout the church age, as in the monastic movement. That comes from there. Origen's heretical cult comes from Alexandria, Egypt. Clement's. Clement used to be into the Egyptian mysteries before he became a Christian. That's Alexandria, Egypt. And the LXX, which has the Bible that does not use the name of the Lord, it just says Lord, or Lord. It actually will change stuff where you can find in the Hebrew Adonai and Yahweh, and they will change the word Yahweh to Kyrios, which is the Greek word for Lord. They will stop using the name Yahweh in their Bibles. Okay? Why? Because they were cursed. If they ever invoke the name of Yahweh, that God is going to pursue them with a curse and with a sword and famine. Those Jews are then going to get chased out of Alexandria by the Christians after the Roman Catholic period, about a century before Islam starts. Those Jews, when they get chased out of Alexandria, are going to live among the Arabs before Islam comes about. Okay? And those Jews, you're going to have a group of them who the Muslims call the Yeseni, which I'm going to suggest to you are the Essenes, because the Essenes are still around in the 3rd century. Hippolytus of Rome is talking about them. I'm going to suggest that the Yeseni are the Essenes. They're going to get a Yemeni kingdom to convert to, this is in the area of the Sabaeans, to convert to Judaism. It's about 100 years after that Ethiopia is going to take over that area and absorb all their literature, and that's how the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees and all these things come into the Ethiopian church. Okay? It was understood that these were the false Jews who made up false cults, who were mixing with the Egyptian mysteries, who were mixing with the Greek philosophies, who wrote the Bible where they take the name of Yahweh out of it. All this stuff. These Jews are going to stay mingled among the Arabs before and after Islam is created. And I'm going to suggest to you that Islam is a merger of Essene Judaism, which is fatalistic and it's all about the tablets of destiny and all this stuff, and the Egyptian mysteries, and Greek philosophy, and Gnosticism. That's what Islam is, okay? So Islam is ultimately going to point to this prophet who people think is the same guy as Enoch and Hermes Trismegistus. He's in their writings. I think his name is like Idris or something like this. And this seems to be the same guy who is Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes Trismegistus seems to be based on Hermes, which is Ham, Thoth, which is the guy who invented hieroglyphics, and Merkur, which is who invents the Sumerian tablets. And they're going to start calling the Sumerian tablets tablets of destiny. Okay? The Sumerian tablets are called tablets of destiny because what these people are going to claim in these Sumerian tablets is that there's heavenly tablets, which their tablets claiming their divine right of rule are a reflection of, and these heavenly tablets are basically fatalistically written before time, and that was their justification for overthrowing these kings and taking over. It's fate, okay? The Egyptians are going to have a version of the Tablets of Destiny, which is in the Book of the Dead. And then the Tablets of Destiny is going to be converted by the Manichaean Gnostics and ultimately the Augustinians and ultimately the Calvinists to be the Book of Life that was written before the foundations of the world and that contains basically all of history because it's all fate. Okay? That is the Babylonian idea of the Tablets of Destiny. History is not written beforehand. In fact, I actually researched this. Watch this. Psalm 139 in the ESV. You need to look at this and compare it with other versions. Okay? Psalm 39, 16 through 17. They've already been caught with the book of Revelation saying that when it says the Lamb's Book of Life that was written from the foundations of the world, in other words, he's recording everything that happens from the beginning of time, they're going to say it was written before the foundations of the world. In other words, everything is recorded before it happens. It's all fatalistically determined. That is bullcrap, okay? They're changing the Bibles to meet fatalism. Now I want you to look at these different translations. Psalm 139, this is the ESV. Let's look at it. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me when there wasn't yet any of them. What is he saying? He's saying everything that you do is fate. It's determined. It's written beforehand. Okay? That's not what the Bible says. Now look at this. Look at the King James. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect. Okay, the word for substance is literally the word for bone. Okay? Yet being unperfect. And in thy book were all, notice this italicized members, my members, they're talking about his limbs, were written, which were in continuance fashion, as yet there were none of them. Okay? What is he saying? And you read 139 carefully. He is saying that when I was in the womb, this is the whole point of this prophecy, is how God has known him since he is in the womb. And it ends with him saying, so try me now and check my heart and see if there's any unrighteousness in me. He is saying, God, nothing is hidden from me. You've been watching me since I was in the womb. You have been keeping track of the formation of my bones, my arms and legs, before there were any of them. So when I was a little zygote, when I was a little fetus, when I was just a blob of cells that became and had a little tiny heartbeat but no arms and legs yet, when I was that, you knew before there were any of my members, my bones. So let's look at what this passage is saying in the context. He's saying, I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. He's talking about being made in the womb. Marvelous are their works, and my soul knoweth them well. My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Okay? Now remember, there's going to be this parallel between a mother's womb and the belly of the earth, because that's the two kinds of birth. Okay? Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect, and in thy book were all my members written in continuance. So this is where they would get the days part. Were fashioned when there was not any of them. My unformed substance means your embryo. Galmi, remember that word golem. Your eyes saw, and upon your book, all of them. So the unformed substance is a singular, but the word literally means bone. In your book, all of them will be written days. So all of them, future tense, will be written. Days were formed and not one among them. So what it's saying is all of his bones, his members, he's writing the days before any of his bones were formed. This is literally the context of what he's saying, is that God is recording his days from even before when his bones were formed, when his members were formed, when he was just an embryo in the womb. That is the context of that, is that God is recording his days from the point before his. You have searched me, past tense, and you know me. You know when I sit and I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. So everything is about God observing him and knowing his ways. It's not about God preordaining his ways, okay? Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. Why? He knows his thoughts. He knows what he's thinking before he's doing it because he's always paying attention to him. You hem me in behind and before. You lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths or in Sheol, you are there. If I rise in the wings of the dawn, if I sail far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. So he's talking about God being present, God observing him, God knowing him, and God even knowing his words before they come out of his mouth, okay? Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me, and light will come around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you, and the night will shine like the day, and the darkness is light from you. I say, I can't hide from you in the dark. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. So notice he's not talking about before I existed. He's talking about in his mother's womb. There is nothing, this is important, because the only other thing you can get to is the preexistence of souls, which is a doctrine based in reincarnation. Okay? It's the doctrine that we were the fallen angels before we fell. There's no other version of that doctrine. It came out of the Egyptian mysteries, and it went into Hinduism, and then it went into the Essenes, and then it went into the Calvinists eventually. Okay? You created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. So notice he's talking about being created in his mother's womb. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. So my frame is his bone. Your eyes saw my unformed body all the day. Where does he get the word ordained from? Oh, your eyes saw my unformed body all the days they were made. So his members were written in a book. So ordained, they're taking the word made, mean ordained, okay? So he's like, your eyes saw my unformed body all the days they were made for me, and that's why the King James says my members were being made. In other words, his arms and legs were being made. Were written in your book before one of them came to be. So they're going to say the days ordained for him were written before they came to be. It's not. He's saying all his days were written from before his members were, before they came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, O Lord, how vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. When I'm awake, I am still with you. So in other words, God is observing him carefully from before his bones were made. That's the point of this, before his members were made. And again, remember, there were Calvinists in the Geneva Bible, okay? Watch. Thine eyes did see me when I was without form, for in thy book were all things written, which in continuance were fashioned, when there was none of them before, okay? This is the Geneva Bible. It's not saying his days were ordained before him. It's saying his days were being recorded when in continuance, in the days they were fashioned. In the days what were fashioned? In the days that his body parts were fashioned, his members were fashioned. Then he says, how dear are my thoughts, if I should count them, they are more than the sand, okay? That's the Geneva Bible. This was written by Calvinists, okay? But this was written by Calvinists before they were so hardcore about their predetermination rules, okay? Then it goes in the King James, in the 1611 King James. Well, remember, the Calvinists don't get super hardcore about their predetermination rules until the Synod of Dort, which I believe is like 1619. It's after the King James is written, okay? That's when they start getting into it. So now they need to go back and they need to write their predetermination and their fatalistic determination in the Bible. And so what do? They change the Bibles to make it, all the days that were ordained before me were written in your book before they're born. That is the exact same doctrine as the tablets of destinies. Okay? That is the exact thing. Everything is pre-written. So what's the point of doing anything? Willing or not willing to do anything? What's the point of trying? What is the point? Everything I do is pre-written. It's fatalistically determined. And that's exactly what the Calvinists believe. Okay? So, we're not going to deal with that crap. We're going to look at where this stuff came from. It's about usurpations and overthrows. That's where the whole doctrine came from, the Cainites, and it's about usurpations and overthrows. Now, we go to Canaan. Remember how it's going to be the descendants of Canaan who bring in homosexuality, okay? Well, in Egypt, we have these guys. Here's Canaan. And we have these guys in Egypt. Now, Egypt gets into makeup and aesthetics very early on, okay? We have these two guys who are the chief manicurists of Egypt. They're all into makeup and manicures and all this stuff. Remember, they're gonna grow tons of crops. The Nile's gonna be very fruitful and effective for them. And once their stuff gets irrigated, they're gonna have a lot of ease on their hands. They're gonna plant their crops and then they're gonna chill. What are they gonna chill and do? They're gonna make themselves look pretty. And so they have these two guys who Canaan is in both of their name. This Canaan Hotep means Canaan is satisfied, and Neank Canaan means I live for Canaan. Okay? First gay couple. Earliest gay couple recorded in history. This is what people believe. The idea of their two noses touching together. These men were buried together. Their two noses were touching together, and they said that's usually a form that is reserved for husbands and wives. And these guys were apparently the chiefs of the manicurists. So they were girlfriends at the nail salon. Dudes. Okay? You can't make this stuff up. It doesn't change. People don't change, okay? Two dudes who do manicures for a living get together, and they both have Canaan in their name. One means I live for Canaan, and one means Canaan is satisfied. Which suggests that homosexuality was probably... Remember, the Canaanites are going to make the Nephilim, and then when those Nephilim get killed, Canaan may still be alive. If he's not alive, he just died and was deified. But it's going to be his descendants that bring the Nephilim back, and then they bring homosexuality in the land in Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay? And surprise, surprise, Canaan is in the name of the first two gay guys in Egypt. Because Canaan was probably there. Remember I told you Canaan is going to go to India and become Kanupa, which means Father Canaan, which is going to become Krishna. He is going to be in the Assyrian's king. No, I'm sorry. He's not in the Assyrian's king list. Sin is. His son Sin is going to be in the Assyrian's king list as Suan. And then the Egyptians are going to come up with other gods after him. So we're going to go to this Aeonad, and we're going to look at these other gods they have. So Nemti we covered. Nemti seems to be the original OG version of Horus. They're worshiping them in Kaft, which seems to be where the Copts are. So the Copts are right here. Remember, the Israelites are going to live down here, but the people with them are going to establish thieves up around here. Min is probably Mantu, and Menes, probably the same guy. He's probably a Nephilim. And he seems to be the same guy as the Scorpion King. This is Scorpion too, but there's the Scorpion King, which they believe is their legendary first king, which is probably they were ruled by gnomes, which are basically just like Enseeds until this one guy took over and unified them as a war machine in the wars that are going to persist until the flood. Okay? He's going to also become to known this Narmer, which is this guy who's depicted as a giant over the rest of them, while these other guys seem to be wrestling something that looks somewhat like a dinosaur or a dragon. A long-necked dragon, like a Diplodocus or something. While another guy is being trampled by a bull. What does that mean? I don't know. And there's Horus, and this pulling out something out of his body. That seems to be his ka, his spirit, something like that. That's my guess. Okay. Yogdoad is Noah and his family. They call the Matani the Matani Naharim, which is literally the people of the marriage alliance among the Nahorites. There's Noah and his 8 sons. First 2 gay guys. All this stuff is going to be in my book in a much better order. This is me verbal processing this stuff. Now we're going to get into the era of the Jews coming in. So we're lining this stuff up, and we see that your Egyptian... Okay, these are their Egyptian deities we're going to cover right now. Anubis is a god of funerals. That's going to be a later god that emerges. Amun is going to be a later god that emerges, and we're going to look at this Assyrian's kings, or the kings list, and see Amun start to appear alongside Ra, because that's Ham. Khnum is going to be in there a little bit, but it's mostly going to be Ra and Ka, and Ra is going to be very predominant until you get to the eras of the Jews being overthrown. And that's when Osiris and Horus start coming in a big way. And Horus seems to be this god named Hari. I don't know what it's based on. Could be of the Horites. Could be those people who were decimated by Amraphel, which Esau's married into. Hori could be him, and that could be where Horus comes from. And it could be just merged with this other god to become Horus. Because if all those people are getting decimated and then they get taken over by the Edomites, these guys might flee to Egypt or something like that. Who knows? Anyways, Apis is the Apis bull. He's believed to be a manifestation or an incarnation of Ptah, and this is going to be the one who the Jews worship in the desert, because he is the high god of the Egyptians after the Jews get overthrown. And so they want to go back to Egypt, and so what are they doing? They're making a calf of Ptah, their high god, and say, basically, we've converted to your god. It was your god who brought us in the wilderness, and he led us to go back. And we're going to serve you now. Aten and Atum are the same thing. It's creator, solar deity. But Aten is what he is called when Akhenaten makes it monotheist. Atum is based on Adam. He's the first god of the Ennead. So the Ennead doesn't call him Ra, it calls him Atum. Okay? Bennu, I don't know, is another solar deity. I don't know who Bes is. Apotropaic god, a dwarf god. Geb is the earth god, so you have Geb and Shu. One's the sky god, one's the earth god. So again, God created the heavens and the earth, right? So you have, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. 1, 2, 3, okay? So that's going to be their Ra, Geb, and Shu. That's why the first thing, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And then they're going to merge that with Yahweh, the son of justice, creating Adam and Eve. They're going to merge those 3 in order. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So God, heavens, earth, Yahweh, Adam, Eve. And then they merge those to become Aten, or Utu, or Ra. Geb and Shu is Adam and Eve. Heavens and earth. Okay? Hereru is an older form of Horus. Horus is the same thing. Remember the other Neptu or whatever. Imhotep says he's the architect and vizier to Djoser. So this is actually a man who was like a prime minister. Djoser would have invented the office of the vizier, which is the same office that Joseph is going to have. He gets deified, so that would be probably pre-flood. Khepri, another solar creator god, a morning aspect of Ra. So they're going to have these different aspects of Ra that are going to be morning, evening, and what they probably are is different ancestors that are deified and merged with the sun god, and they're just going to mix this stuff up. Khnum, again, is the ram god. That's Canaan. Khonsu is the moon god. So Khonsu literally means he who travels, which is interesting because Ham is ultimately he's going to be buried in a city in Pakistan that means city of the wanderer or the traveler. Okay, Khonsu means he who travels. So remember how I said they mix up N's and M's at the end of the word? That could be Ham. That could be another word for Ham, but it's Khan. And then Su means he, so he who travels. Moon god, a son of Ammon and Mut. So this could be Ham, and this could be Canaan. Mahi's a lion god, son of Bastet. Montu, a god of war, and the sun worshipped at Thebes. So this is Montu, probably is Min. He's a god of virility. Thu, Ju, and Tu. Enduring one. So the two means one. The enduring one. Okay. So the enduring one, or the steadfast, he is the war god. Is the long-life Nephilim that ruled them. This guy could have been ruling them for hundreds of years before the flood. Nefertem, lotus blossom, which is the sun god rising at the beginning of Ptah. So notice they keep associating with the sun god. But the lotus or lily seems to be, again, in the north you're going to have a swan. In the south you're going to have a lily. It seems to be an early representation of the Holy Spirit lighting upon the waters. Anurus is a god of war and hunting. I would assume Anurus is probably Osiris. Or I'm sorry, not Osiris, but Anurus is probably Nimrod or Orion. God of war and hunting, worshipped in Abydos. I would assume that's Nimrod. It says he also has a counterpart in Nubia, which is where Cush is, and Nimrod is the son of Cush. So I would assume Anurus is probably Orion. Osiris is going to be based on Abel. Ptah, like I said, is going to be based on Tubal-Cain because he's the craftsman, and they're going to say that he crafted all the other gods. Earlier, remember, these are going to be later myths and legends that come up. Earlier ones are going to say Ra was self-created. He created himself by contemplating himself, which makes no sense. He's eternal, okay? But later it's going to be Ptah made all the gods, and the first one he made was Ra. Set is the god of storms in the wilderness, which is Yahweh appearing in the storm in the wilderness to Job. And then he's going to become the murderer of Osiris. They're essentially merging him with Cain. After, they're also going to call the last king of the Hyksos Apophis, which is their version of Satan. And they're going to make Set, instead of being the helper of Ra, who helps kill the serpent, they're going to make Set the murderer of Osiris. Shu, I talked about there, that's being the, it's basically the heavens and the earth. It's associated with the wind or the air. And so they're kind of merging the Holy Spirit with the heavens and the earth, but they're going to reverse them to be male and female because that's the order Adam and Eve were created. So it's heavens, earth, sun. It's God created the heavens, the earth merged with the sun God created Adam and Eve. Sobek is going to be a crocodile god. Okay, now Sobek seems to be Sheba. Okay, so Sobek is a crocodile god. In Nubia, you have a god named Sebu-Meker. Remember, Nubia is just south of Egypt, and this seems to be Sheba, and there's another god named Didun. Well, Sheba and Dedan. The Meker means something like the progenitor, or it's related to the word maker, but it has to do with the person who is that they come from. Okay, so in Sheba they come from Sebu or Sebe maker. It's Sheba is our maker, our progenitor. That's an easy way to remember it, is Sheba's our maker. And then there's another god named Dedan. Okay, so the people of Sheba, it's later going to become the queen of Sheba, is going to be related to Sheba, and Sheba's brother is Dedan. And those are their gods, Sheba and Dedan. Okay, so Sebu, Meker, and Didun are going to be their gods. Thoth is the god of knowledge, and he seems to be the guy who invents hieroglyphics. Hammon is going to be the guy who probably teaches them to read hieroglyphics. Ham or Canaan. And so Thoth becomes their version of, and Merkur, but remember, these are two different language systems in two different regions. One was probably originally invented by the Sethites afterwards, and then one was invented by these Egyptians after they left. And they could have kept their stuff in secret code or whatever, so the Canaanites couldn't read it, because the Canaanites could read cuneiform. It could be. Now we have all these goddesses. Amunet is just girl Ammon, which is just Ham's wife. Anput, goddess of funerals. Anhuket, a lot of these guys are just, you see ets at the end of them, is just the feminine version of something. Bat is a cow, so whoever's the wife of the bull of heaven is, I think it's Ba and Bat. Hathor is, I think, another cow goddess, but you see a lot of them associated with sun. One of her many forms is the Eye of Ra, is depicted as a cow. Heka is a frog goddess that has to protect with women in childbirth. My guess is she's probably, it could just be because women are dying in childbirth, but this could also be because it's based on the one who's the midwife for everybody. Hesat, another cow goddess. And again, these could literally be Hathor and Hesat. They could just be the same gods in some of the 7 different languages. Imenta is an afterlife goddess associated with Isis and Hathor, so that could be Anuna. And then Isis is the name that emerges. Remember, the name Ishtar has already been around among the Canaanites. Her legends are based on Inanna, but the Isis could be a derivative of Ishtar or Ashtoreth. Okay. Isis is the wife of Osiris, just like Onana is the wife of Anubis. And then Horus comes, okay? Now you're going to have this weird legend that's going to emerge in the 19th century, how it was originally Nimrod, Semiramis, and then Tammuz was their son. There's nothing in the ancient world to reflect that, okay? Nothing whatsoever. Nimrod was not married to Semiramis. You have a Ninus and Semiramis, who are a mother and son, it seems to be, or a mother or a woman and her lover, who exists in the time of the Assyrian kingdom, which is 1,000 years after Babylon, and her name is Samu Samarad or something like that. This is where Semiramis comes from, okay? Semiramis is going to be recorded by, I think it's Thucydides. This is like going to be like 4th century, and it's eventually going to go into Paulus Orosius, who's a disciple of Augustine, in his History Against the Pagans, which has very, very little about this, and he is going to conclude that Ninus and Semiramis are Nimrod and his wife, because Ninus just has an N in it. Of course, Nin is like literally the generic term for lord or master in the Near East. And so tons of names have Nins in them, but he doesn't know this. He just knows Ninus because it has trickled down from the Greek writers to the Romans, okay? And then that's going to go into Bishop Usher's thing, and then they're going to say that Tammuz was their son based on nothing, okay? In fact, it's Isis is the wife of Dumuzid, which is the Egyptian version is Osiris, and then Horus is their child, and Horus is considered to be kind of like an incarnation of Ra, because if you understand what's going on in the Book of the Dead, and the Book of the Dead is long and boring, it's like 500 pages, and there's just a bunch of just incantations and stuff like that. A lot of the stuff that's going into it is basically what they're calling our God is not really our God, it's this God. Well, remember, you have the confusion of languages 150 years before that, and what you have is the priesthoods are getting together with all their different gods and all their different languages now, and saying this God is really that God, and they're mixing them and merging them together and figuring out who the true God is, and they're trying to have a renaissance of what they believe Egypt to have been in its glory before these foreigners, Hyksos, moved in. And they don't ever mention the Hyksos by name, but they mention invaders that came from the east. And so they're going to be saying, some say this God is that, some say this God is that God, but some say he's really this guy. And they're literally just coming up with all these names because they have 7 different languages and trying to figure out who these gods are supposed to be. They end up with basically saying Set, who is the god the Hebrews worship, or the Hyksos worship, this storm god, is the murderer of Osiris. So they're going to merge him with Cain. And then they're going to say Horus is, they're actually going to say this god Ma'au, this cat god Ma'au, is really Ra. And so the idea is like our real gods are hiding beneath these gods, these lower gods, because their Ra is really this Temnu, or this, it's another name for Aten or Adam, this Temnu that they're worshiping, that came from these guys who invaded from the east. And the real gods are hiding in, this is where reincarnation comes from, okay? As these lower gods, okay? Their spirits, their Ka is in the bodies of these lower gods, and but they're really going to come back up to the top, and that's why they take these other gods, these new gods and these lower gods, and put them over the original gods, okay? Maat is going to be the wife of Thoth, so it seems like Thoth invents writing and she invents laws, so this is probably a famous pre-flood person. Mut is another consort of Ammon. I don't know who that is. Neith is a creator hunter goddess, so this is probably just the female version of this Oniris or whatever. Nephthys is the consort of Set, who mourned Osiris alongside Isis. So Nephthys could have been Seth's wife, or based on Eve, probably. The daughter of Nut and Geb. So they're going to form these into families later, but they're going to keep being different. So none of them are really that relevant. That's about it. The point is, Hapi is where the Apis bull comes from. The point is, there's tons of gods. There's tons of gods in Egypt, just like there's tons of gods in India. India's going to have more gods because they're going to have a lot more languages. It's that simple. That's why they have millions of gods. They just have millions of languages, and a lot of them are the same people. But remember, you need to look at all these gods, and you need to realize, imagine how many gods they have. Then imagine the famous people in Egypt, their patriarchs, the people who were the heads of their cities probably before the flood are all considered gods. And then these people who are based on the Noahic table of nations are probably all gods. And then people that are based on the patriarchs from before the flood are probably all gods. And then you're going to have the serpent and Ra and Ka. Ka is not considered a god. It's more like a life force. And it's this idea that it's going to seep into the early church that they're going to call the Holy Spirit the active energy. They're going to treat the Holy Spirit like a force rather than a person of the Trinity among these people who are influenced by the Egyptian mysteries. Again, when you read the early church fathers, you're going to find out that there's a guy named Arnobius. He's the same guy who comes up with conditional immortality, okay? Based on Plato. He's very openly saying this is based on Plato. He reveres Plato. They would call these guys divines, okay? What these early church fathers believed, especially around Alexandria, Egypt, and in Caesarea, where Origen's basically cult school existed, was that the Greek philosophers were sent to the Gentiles like the prophets were sent to the Hebrews, and they believed the things that they were saying were semi-inspired. And those ideas are going to persist until the time of Augustine. You're going to find Augustine still making comments on Hermes Trismegistus and on Plato and stuff like this, and there's still a certain amount of agreement there, but you can tell he's starting to look at it and go, but it's almost like they're saying the same truth, but they're corrupting it. Like, he's starting to see, like, maybe this stuff has demonic origin, but he's not calling it out like that, and he's heavily influenced by it, okay? So you're seeing this in Augustine, but remember, Augustine is 5th century. By this time, you've thoroughly merged the state religion of Egypt, or the state religion of the Romans, which is heavily influenced by Greek philosophy and the Egyptian mysteries, in with the Christian church. This is why Augustine is recording in his Confessions how Christians are trying to put food on the tombs of the saints and stuff like that. They're starting to practice rituals that the Egyptians practiced with their gods. Why? Because they're pagans. They're not real Christians. Their state religion has now become Christianity, and these people who are really pagans are like, yeah, we practice this and we call this Mary and we call these saints now, but they're really just the same old rituals and gods that we always had, and they're just following them superstitiously, okay? That's how they understand it. So when you get to the era of the Jews coming in now, they're going to come in under Joseph, and it's going to be around 1700 BC. 1700 BC is going to be around the time. Remember, you're going to have I'm going to use the biblical timeline, which what I'm doing in my book is I'm aligning the archaeological date of the Exodus, which is 1446, and I go back to the time of Joseph, and it puts you, I think, around 1670 or something like that is when they go into Egypt, okay? You have long, middle, and short chronologies of when all this Egyptian and, you have like up to 5 different spectrums of chronology that these archaeologists are going to claim. So there's going to be a range of 150, 200 years in all this stuff. And then you're going to have obvious propaganda that's in these things where they're just adding and removing years and erasing kings and adding kings, okay? But when you when you line it up with what the Bible says, you have the Jews coming in around 150 years before the Book of the Dead is first published. Now, there's stuff from the Book of the Dead that pre-exists. This idea of funerary rites and rituals and incantations that help you get past the gods or the pillars or the tests that determine where you go in the afterlife pre-existent. We're going to find this on pyramid texts and coffin texts. But the Book of the Dead as like a magic book on what you're supposed to do when somebody dies, and all this stuff related to the gods and this clear gods being hidden in other gods and stuff like that, seems to emerge around the 16th century, which is when the Jews are going to get overthrown. So it's going to be the beginning of the 17th century that they're going to come into Egypt. It's the middle of the 18th century that they're going to be overthrown. And then, it's going to be the middle of the 16th century that they're going to be overthrown. And then it's going to be the middle of the 15th century that they come out of Egypt. So they're there in the ballpark of 230 years, ballpark. I think the Jews say it's like 224 or 234 years, like the rabbis and stuff like that, which is pretty accurate, okay? So let's see, the Assyrian kings list. I think we're kind of done with this. We've talked about this in the past video. Tefnut we're done with. I don't think that's the right God. It might be. I'm getting Shu and Geb and Tefnut and get them all these mixed up. And again, that's going to be in my book. Sorting out these gods and who I think they were and what their relationship to the Bible seems to be. Okay, so then we're going to go to the Hyksos. The Hyksos come in. According to early records, they seem to have come in peacefully without a war. However, Manetho, which is going to be in the time of Ptolemy II, is going to say, after a judgment by God, they came in and pillaged and destroyed all their temples. Okay, well, the judgment by God is Joseph's famine. And they didn't pillage all their temples, but what they probably did, it does say that Joseph basically deported people throughout the country. Okay, so what he's doing is he's doing the exact same thing the Assyrians did in their empire, which is this. You're moving people back and forth throughout the country because they've all sold their lands to the Pharaoh, okay, in order for food. And so what you don't want these people doing is being the managers of their own lands that they sold to Pharaoh so they can rise up in rebellion later. And so they move them all across the country to different lands to manage, and they're managing those lands. And the Pharaoh's giving them crop seed and all this stuff, and they're managing their lands, and they're paying their taxes to Pharaoh, and they're paying a 20% tax. It's still less than we pay here in the U.S., but back then that was a big tax, okay? So they're paying 20% to Pharaoh. This is how Pharaoh's getting more rich and more powerful. With that money, he's basically supporting the administrative class, which is the Hebrews, and then the Hebrews are setting up canals from Avaris to Crete to Elisha or Cyprus, and then to Byblos and up through Carchemish to their guys. The Jews start out ruling. Let's look at the Promised Land. When you see Egypt in its absolute heyday, now this is 1450 BCE, they don't really control this in 1450. Some of their last battles are going to be up here in 1450. Remember, they do control this in 1450. 1450 because the Jews are going to come out in 1446. Okay, so the Egyptians at the height of their empire, they're collecting tribute from Punt. This is Put. I think they're collecting tribute from Nubia, and then they're so here's Cush, see, and they're ruling over Cush. Remember that happens. Moses takes that over when he's a prince of Egypt, and then they rule all the way up to Canaan, all the way up to Carchemish. So you see Byblos and Carchemish, all the way up to the Cilicia region. They did have, again, remember the Danites are going to form Mycenae. Knossos is going to be down here. Thebes, I think, is going to be up here around near Athens, I think. And then Argos is also going to be on this Peloponnese, this peninsula here. And then the Judahites are going to rule in this area of Hebron. It's called Har Yaakov, the mountain of Jacob. This is all over Egyptian symbols that they found. And then the Manassites are going to rule up here in the Goshen region. So it's south of Damascus, north of the Dead Sea. So the Goshen region. They're going to rule there until the Amorites are going to get kicked out, and they're going to come back with their Nephilim, and they're going to kick these guys out, and they're going to go to Egypt. And if you read Manetho's history, he's going to talk about how when they overthrew the Hyksos, who were ruling up to Thebes, Thebes gets established as a new capital on the other sea. You have Memphis up here. They take over Thebes because it's now in the center of the bigger Egyptian kingdom that they control. And Memphis, which used to be the capital over here, is like a secondary capital. Heliopolis is the city of On, or it's also called, I think it's called Anum, which is where Joseph is married to the high priest. And then Avaris is going to be where the Hebrews' capital is. Okay? And like I said, they're going to have a canal. You see Tanis, Avaris to Tanis. This canal is going to connect Avaris to Tanis, and they're going to be able to sail right from here to here, 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 and here. And they're going to basically control the bronze trade that's coming from England with the Egyptians. And then they're going to get bronze sickle swords. And then from these guys up here who are merging with the Japhethites. The Japhethites are going to invent or reinvent. We have clear evidence of the chariot existing in India and in Sumer before the flood. But it's going to come back under the Japhethites who have the horses. And it's going to start out in like the Russia-Ukraine area and come back down. They're going to bring it down through here, and chariots are going to come from them, and the horses are going to come from them. And that's why Egyptians are going to have great horse breeders, because they picked those up from the Jews, from the Japhethites, when they were getting them from their relatives here. And then the Egyptians are going to breed horses and eventually sell them to Solomon when the Jews are ruling this. Okay? So this is their absolute heyday. This is the peak of their kingdom. And what you're going to have is a priesthood, because it says that Joseph scattered all the Egyptians to the different parts of the empire. So they're deporting everybody so they can't start a tribal, because remember, they're speaking different languages now. They can't start a tribal rebellion because they are a bunch of people who speak different languages. And what you're going to have is limited ability to cooperate. You're going to have peasants who can farm and do all this stuff. They know what they're doing, and guys who can take care of them. And they're going to, in a limited degree, the educated are going to know how to read hieroglyphics. And so that's still going to be a standard of communication throughout the empire. But you're never going to have a mob of people who all speak the same language well, who are going to be able to unite together and fight. If they can't unify around their relationship with each other, what are they going to unify around? And so what ends up happening is that's how the Hyksos, and I believe to be the Caphtorim, because remember, Copt is right around here, Caphtorim, okay? And there's Thebes is not too far. So Luxor is the modern name. So the city of Copt, where the Copterites are, it's called Kif today, and Thebes is called Luxor. They're just 20 miles away. So this is why I believe, one of the many reasons why I believe the Jews co-ruled with the Coptor, and then they took over Crete with the Coptor, and that's why they call it Keft. Okay? So the Coptorim were the youngest brothers of the Egyptians, if we look at Genesis. It says the Ludim, Anamim, Lebahim, Naphtuhim, Pathruhim, Kalsuhim, and Coptorim. So of the 7 sons of Egypt, they were the youngest one, the Copts. Okay? And the Copts are down here, and yet they end up taking over all of Egypt with these guys. This is who Joseph seems to be in league with. And then they're going to rule down here, and when they get driven out, they seem to become the Abydos dynasty. And notice you're going to see the Ra's at the end of their names. Why? Look at Ra, 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 Ra. Why? Because they worship Ra. Okay? Ra is the priest of An, which the Jews seem to be fine with as the Egyptian version of Yahweh. Because Yahweh is the son of justice, the son of righteousness, okay? And so you have these guys, so you still have the Ari in their name, okay? They're worshippers of Ra. And when they get overthrown by the next dynasty, 17th dynasty, no, that's the late second, is mainly Theban rulers and contemporary with the Hyksos. Okay, I'm sorry, no, it's the 17th dynasty that seems to be co-ruling with the Hyksos. So I could be wrong that, well, no, the Abydos dynasty could be them after they get driven out. It's the 18th dynasty that is going to begin the New Kingdom period, I believe. And it started by Amhos the First, and this is going to be the guy who overthrows the Hyksos. Okay, so this is going to be the guy, and they're going to run. I believe the people see Abydos right here. Remember how the Copts are right there. Okay, there's Abydos. The Abydos dynasty is basically going to be the remnants of the Caphtorites who get kicked out of Thebes, and these guys are going to take over Thebes. They're going to take over Memphis again. They're going to take over Heliopolis again, and they're going to drive the Jews back into Avaris. They had been all the way up and down here. Okay, I mean, remember, Moses overthrows the Cushites, so the Jews were all up and down here. The Danites, when you look at them going into Egypt, if you go to Genesis 46, and they're listing all the sons, Dan, Bilhah, Naphtali, the sons of Dan, Hushim, just one. Which means Dan probably had a lot of daughters. Remember how you have the myth of the Danites murdering all the Egyptian princes? It's probably the Danites who are marrying in with the Caphtorites in a big way because he only has one son going into Egypt, which means he probably has a lot of daughters. Okay? So what happens to the Caphtorites after the Egyptians? Well, what they are is they're married in with the Danites and they become the Hebrews. They become part of the Hebrews because they're really Hebrew women married in Danites, so they're Hebrew kids. And when these guys get run out of Egypt, a lot of them are going to merge with the Hebrews. And so the reason you have all these Danites afterwards, and these Danites are very familiar with Crete and the Argives and all these places, is because they established them with the Danites who were married in with them in a big way. Shouldn't be rocket science to figure this out. All the rest of these guys, I mean, look at Rachel has 14 sons born from her. Dan has one. Naphtali has 1, 2, 3, 4, and he's his younger brother. Everybody has sons and grandsons by this time, but Dan just has one son, which means he's probably having nothing but daughters, and his son's probably having nothing but daughters, which means those are the Danites who are married in with the Egyptians, and they're going to get a reputation of having murdered all the Egyptians after Hercules. This is going to be a Greek myth that starts later. Well, why? Because the Danites are with the Egyptians here, and here, and they're going to hear by sea travel about all the Egyptians falling. And who are they going to hear it from? These Danite women who leave Egypt because they're married in with the princes, and they go to, I think, this place around here. They're a bunch of Danite widows, basically. Well, what happened? Well, they were married to a bunch of the firstborn of Egypt, and then they died because the Danites had been married to the Caphtorites for a while. Okay? So again, the Abydos dynasty is what seems to be there in parallel with this other dynasty that seems to be rising up and taking over. And these dynasties are not necessarily successive. They're just counting them in terms of when they emerged. Okay? So you have the Abydos dynasty, the Thebes, and right in between them is going to be the city of Copt, which is where these original gods are worshipped, and that's where the Copts are. And the Egyptians, to this day, the Egyptian Christians call themselves Coptic Christians. Okay? So now, when they come in, the guy who seems to be their first leader, and their dating is way off. Their great leader, there's two rulers among the people who came from the Hyksos who have the most of their seals around. And the first one is going to be Yakbeam Sennacherib, okay? Yakbeam means, remember the eem means to be descended from that person, or the plural of that, okay? So you could say Jacobs or the Jacobites, okay? So the Yakbeam are the Jacobites. Your Egyptologists, your anti-Bible Egyptologists are going to be like, oh, there are just tons of people in the Amorites and the Canaanites who are named Jacob. Okay? Show me a famous Jacob. Show me any of their writings or inscriptions of another famous Jacob, because you have this guy named, you have a mountain of Jacob, and then you have Jacobite. What does second ray mean? It means he who causes Ra to shine. The guy who saved Egypt from a famine and made them the most powerful kingdom on Egypt, do you think they might call him the Jacobite who causes Ra to shine? He's married in with the priest of On, which is where Ra is worshipped. This is Jacob, or this is Joseph. Yes, they have found, modern archaeologists have found 138 of these seals around Egypt. They're like, oh, that can't be. We're going to date this to 1805 to 1780. 100 years, 150 years before. Why? Why are you going to do that? How do you know you're not wrong on your dating? Because these guys all disagree on their dating, okay? Sennacherib is not just he who causes Ra to shine. There's tons of Egyptian pharaohs whose name is Sennacherib. Watch this. It's not just this Yakbeam. That's the Jacobite who causes Ra to shine. All these pharaohs, because they worship Ra, these seals are found in the Levant, so Canaan and Nubia and Egypt. Gee, that's everywhere where the Jews were. No, it's just a coincidence. There's just a bunch of people named Jacob running around. Get rid of your anti-biblical bias, and it's not that hard to figure out, okay? Now, by like the 14th dynasty, the 14th dynasty they believe to be from 1725 BC. That's going to be right before the Jews get there, to 1650 BC. That's going to be the period where the Jews are basically ruling Egypt. They're the prime ministers, but they're ruling essentially. And the kings are basically like their sons. After a century or so of the Jews ruling, are just chilling in the royal palace while the Jews are doing all the heavy lifting in terms of the government administration. So they're seen as the rulers, even though they're still there. Okay. So this is the 17th dynasty. Let's see what their kings' names are. Yakbeam Sennacherib. That sounds like Joseph. Nubasare. There's Ray. There's Ray. Atafare. Okay. Notice chronological position is contested. Might be a vassal of the 15th dynasty. Chronological condition is so the scholars don't even agree on when these are. But this guy's going to say this guy's going to be way back here in the 1800s, or maybe he's up here right around where Joseph shows up. But what's going to happen is, notice all these guys end with Ra, 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 Ra. You see the Ray at the end, Ra, 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 Ra. All of them at the end is Ra. Why? Because they worship Ra, where Joseph is married in with the priesthood. And then, look, surprise, 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 Nuya, Shanesh, Shinshek, Wazad, Kamara, Yakareb, Yakub Har, that's the mountain of Jacob. So this is a guy, this is the location on the mountain of Jacob, okay? Marisaway, let's see what Marisaway means. Beloved of the powerful Ra. Beloved of the mighty Ra. So his name is Beloved of the mighty Ra on the mountain of Jacob. Who is that? Probably whoever is ruling Hebron at the time. And then Apophis. Who is Apophis? Apophis is the last king of the Hyksos dynasty. Why would he name himself after the serpent? He wouldn't. That's what his enemies are calling him. Why would he name himself after their serpent of chaos? There's no way he would. That's what his enemies are calling him. They're calling him Satan. He's the great Satan. Okay? Notice how these people disagree. These are major scholars. Kim Ryholt's a woman. I think this guy's, I forget his first name, but he's a man. These people say they're 14th dynasty. These people say they're 16th dynasty. Why don't they agree? Probably because one is more liberal than the other. One's got more of an axe to grind than the other. That would be my guess. So they're going to say these are the dynasty. Again, it's going to be around somewhere between 1730 BC and 1670 BC that Joseph seems to come into Egypt. Okay? So this dynasty exists in the era surrounding where Joseph comes in, and this guy named the Jacobite who causes Ra to shine is one of their most prominent rulers. Can't make this stuff up. So this is the 14th dynasty. It's going to be succeeded by the 15th, 16th, and the Abydos dynasty. Well, who are the 15th, 16th, and Abydos dynasty? Well, they're not three successive dynasties. The 15th is the Hyksos. The 16th is the people who try to overthrow the Hyksos and ultimately do. Or no, I'm sorry. They're the ones who first start rebelling against the Hyksos. And then the Abydos dynasty seems to be the remnants of the Cushites when they succeed. That's who they are. See where this is? Again, what's right here? Thebes is right here. So this is them getting backed off. Okay? Now, I have to double check this, but I'm reading this book on the history of the world's religions. I've actually finished it. This is Michael Witzel is the author, and it's the origin of the world's mythologies. This guy, that's cool if that's facing the right way. This guy is, I believe this is Oxford. This is a professor of Oxford. And so this is one of the leading scholars on comparative mythology. He mentions genetic evidence of people from Abydos being in India, which I need to double check that before I put that in my book. But that would make a lot of sense because it's here. Remember, the Jews were worshiping idols in Egypt, and they seem to be syncretizing with Egyptian stuff. Okay? The other people of that overthrow Thebes, these are going to be basic. It basically seems to be led by the priesthood, because the priesthood would have stayed intact, and they would have been working towards with probably the descendants of the elder sons of Egypt to overthrow and get people in power who aren't in league with these foreign Hyksos. This is not a strange thing when you think about how these people have had their languages changed. They have all basically become the peasants of Pharaoh. Pharaoh owns all their lands. And they're not calling, just so you know, they don't start calling pharaohs until after the Egyptians get overthrown. The title of Pharaoh has to do with basically being incarnated by the gods and stuff like that. They're just called kings or whatever they're called. They're not using the term Pharaoh until around this new kingdom period. And then by that time, even in the Bible, Moses is going back, because Moses is 100 years after that, and he's just calling all the kings of Egypt in all the times before that pharaohs, because that's what they call their kings. Okay, but what you're going to have is these guys are going to overthrow Thebes. They're going to we're going to read about this in the next one. The Hyksos are ruling. Notice you have from here to here, because they've got people all the way from the Mitanni kingdom to here, and this is why Egypt is doing so well. The Mitanni kingdom is basically keeping the Assyrians down, and that is basically helping them contend with the Hittites and the Amorites. So Egypt is basically unmolested by the Canaanites. This is why they're becoming so powerful. Cush starts to rebel. My guess is what happens here is because they're suppressing Cush, what you have here is probably Egyptian nobles leading, that are not necessarily of the Pharaoh's family, leading in fighting against the Cushites and keeping them down, and they become stronger and more militant, and they eventually decide to just overthrow the Hyksos and this other earlier dynasty. That's probably what happens. And then it is the Theban dynasty could be a different dynasty. This is going to be the 16th dynasty. This period from 1649 to 1582 seems to be the ruling dynasty that is in power. And I don't know if these would be considered different dynasties. I think they're the same ones, but they just moved the capital to Thebes. And then the 17th dynasty, is also in Thebes from 1580 to 1550. Now, maybe there are overthrows going on. I don't know why these are considered different dynasties. I haven't read every detail of this. But you notice here's the Hyksos. And I don't know why they have the Hyksos way out here. Like, why would they be out there? Hyksos are going to be running some. Oh, you know why? Because they're Hyksos. They're going to be counting these as the Edomites and the Ammonites, and all these people are going to be calling them all Hyksos. So you have Edomites, Lot, Moab, all these people. They just call them all Hyksos because Hyksos just means rulers of foreign lands, and they're all Hebrews. There's just the Egyptian word for Hebrews. It's the Canaanites and the Assyrians that call them Haparu. Okay, the Egyptians just call them Hyksos. These are the rulers of the foreign lands. And you see where they are. There's where the Philistines are. This is where the Edomites and the Moabites are. This is all the way up here is going to be where your Hebron is, and then up here is going to be where your Manassites are. And then they're going to be ruling all of Egypt with them. Then you get to the 18th dynasty in 1550. This is roughly, remember, if they come out in 1446 BC, that's 106 years after this, okay? What Manetho records about the Hyksos is that they go and get, when they drive them all back to Avaris, right here, then a bunch more, they actually say they drive them out of Egypt. This is what they say. They drive them out of Egypt, but then they get a bunch more Hyksos from Jerusalem and come back. And then they take Avaris and they're not able to drive them out. This is probably not true. What you probably have is them subjugating them back to Avaris. And yes, you probably have some warfare going on. And the reason why you have this going on is because, remember, the Hebrews are the legitimate government administration of Egypt that is getting overthrown. Okay? So it's not like they're going out without a fight. They're not just going to be like, oh, somebody else is in charge now, let's just submit to this guy. No, they get subdued by these people. And so what do? Is they overthrow Thebes. The government they overthrow seems to retreat to Abydos, and that seems to be where that government dies. They're eventually going to get Memphis and Heliopolis, this is where Joseph's married into the priesthood. Memphis was the original capital before they built Thebes. And then they're going to push them back to Avaris, and at the same time, the Amorites are getting pushed out of here by the Kashites. So they're going to get sacked by the Hittites. The Hittites are going to sack Babylon, and then they're just going to leave. And then the Kassites are going to come through, and the Kassites are going to push the Amorites out, and the Amorites are going to come back here with Nephilim, and they're going to kick out the Manassites from here and the Judahites from here. And this is why you have Og, king of Bashan, ruling here, and you have Arba and his sons, which are all Nephilim, ruling up in Hebron when they get there. Okay? So all these Manassites and Judahites that were in the highlands of the Golan and the Hebron area are going to rejoin the Jews here at Avaris. This is important. Also, you're going to have the Danites who are here, without that Egyptian support, because the Egyptian Navy was covering their butts. Well, this is all a trade system they set up with the Egyptians. A lot of these guys are going to come back to Avaris. And so what you end up having is these people who you think you're driving them out of here, and here. That's because mostly what they have there is administrations. They probably have some guards, but they don't have armies here. Their people are spread all the way up into here, all the way up into Carchemish, all the way up into Elisha and Crete and blah, blah, blah. And when they start getting driven out of these cities here, they're all going to be kind of pulling together around Avaris and Goshen. And that's why after they overthrow them within 20 years, they're multiplying like rabbits. They're too many of us. And this is when they decide to kill all the babies. Okay? So what you have with the Egyptians here, these Hyksos or Hebrews are 25% of their population. That's huge. So imagine now, Egypt is ruling over this, which is a bunch of people that they're oppressing. And at their doorstep is Avaris, where there's the Jews there, and they're 25% of them. So they're 25% of their entire population is right here, but all these lands they're ruling over here, these are Amorites, these are, I mean, the Jews aren't necessarily friends with them either, but they're Amorites, and then these people over here are Hyksos, the Edomites. They see that they're all related, right? So you have these enemies here, these Midianites here. They're all their enemies. They're not necessarily at war with them, but they're all related. All these people are related to them. And so what is their rationale for killing all the babies? They will join with our enemies against us. They're afraid of them getting allies from all these people here and coming back and taking over Egypt again. So they kill all the firstborn. That's 20 years after they overthrow them that they do that, 25 years. And that's when Moses is born. It's going to be 80 years after Moses is born that they go out of Egypt. And according to the Egyptians in Manetho, this guy named Moises, who was originally called Osiris, that's what they're claiming. He was originally called Osiris. Is a priest. Changes his name to Moises, and then leads the Jews out. He's a priest. Well, it does say that Moses was trained up in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, which suggests that he was trained up in their mysteries. This suggests that he understood the Book of the Dead. It suggests that he was trained up in their priesthood, and their main god that they're worshiping now is Osiris. So he probably isn't called Osiris, but there is a possibility that he could have been at some point in time a priest of Osiris or something like that. Because he's trained up in all the mysteries of the Egyptians, the wisdom of the Egyptians. Remember, he is the son, supposedly divinely given son of the daughter of Pharaoh. And then her brother is going to become the next Pharaoh. So he's high up there, Moses is, and it makes sense that they would have a guy in the priesthood. Because the priesthood is who overthrew. The priesthoods are often involved in the overthrow of kings, wherever you go. So Moses seems to become a prince of Egypt. For 40 years, he's a middle-aged man by the time he goes out into the wilderness of Midian, and then he is a shepherd under the priest of Midian here. So you want to understand how educated Moses is. He is, before he meets Yahweh. I'm not saying I believe he was talking to Yahweh about the contents of the Bible as he was writing it. Okay, I don't think Yahweh was dictating to him what to write, and he was writing it, with the exception of the law. I think a lot of the historical stuff. He was 40 years married in with the priest of Midian, who is going to be a descendant of Abraham, and then he's 40 years being trained up in the wisdom of the Egyptians. So probably as an adult, 25 years of that. Plus 40 years of that. He knows the history of the Semites. He knows the history of the Egyptians. And then he writes the Bible with Yahweh as his editor, basically. You can't make this stuff up. How well does that match with the dates? Even with all the crap that they're trying to pull with, I don't believe that, I don't believe that, I don't believe that, I don't believe that. Okay, you don't have to believe anything. The Jews are radically wrong on the dates of the Bible, and the reason they're radically wrong is because it goes all the way to the Persian period, where the Jews are not counting any of the Persian kings that archaeology and history count. They're just counting the Persian kings that are listed in the Bible, and they think that's all there is. And so the reason why the Jews think it's like 57 or close to like 5800 BCE is because they're literally axing out like several Persian kings. I mean, it's like half a dozen Persian kings they're axing out. And they don't really have a good historical record from the time of Zerubbabel to the time of because the Bible's not keeping a historical record from that time. They have Zerubbabel and then they have Ezra, not realizing that they're like 80 years apart. Okay, so the book of Ezra has Zerubbabel and Ezra, and then they're going to write apocryphal literature that places Zerubbabel under Artaxerxes, which he would have been dead long before them, and they're going to have stuff related to, like, basically the period between the Persians and the Greeks taking over, which the Persians rule from I think it's like the 6th century to around the 3rd century. 300 years, they're going to truncate that to like 100 years. Because they're just going to have like Darius the Mede, this is why people don't think Darius the Mede is a real person. They're going to have Cyrus in Daniel, and then they're going to have Ahasuerus, who they're going to claim as Artaxerxes, which Artaxerxes is actually his son, and it's the son that overthrows the son that he picks to be the king, who is Esther's son-in-law, or married to Esther's daughter. So they're gonna cut out Xerxes. They're gonna cut out the king that rules during the time of Esther, and this is why you have these scholars who don't believe that Esther should be in the Bible. They think it's made up. And then we'll get on this in the later portions of my book, because that's a big deal. But then they're going to get down to Artaxerxes. They're just going to skip between Cyrus to Artaxerxes, which is like, yeah, they don't realize there's multiple Artaxerxes and that there's multiple Dariuses. And it's going to mention Darius in the book of Ezra, and they're going to think that's Darius the first when it's Darius the second. And they just skip all these kings that aren't there, and that's how they cut out like 200 years of their history. It's not because their biblical history, according to the Masoretes, is off. It's because their intertestamental history is off. So what you end up with is the Jews thinking that the Exodus is 200 years after it is because of that. And modern scholarship is going to claim that the Jewish Exodus is 200 years after it is, which puts it in the 12th century, because that's what the Jews are saying throughout the entire Middle Ages. They're wrong on their history, but nobody in the Middle Ages really understands Persian history well, because the stuff that we have on Persian history that we understand now comes from archaeological inscriptions that are like 1800s and later, and comes from Greek history that the Jews did not respect. So you're going to have these Greek historians that come, and there's going to be Greeks who are associated with, they're actually serving the Persians as mercenaries before the Greeks start fighting. And you have Greeks in there's a Greek physician in the temple court. I think that's Thucydides. You're going to have Xenophon, which is actually like a commander of Greek mercenaries working under the Persians. So they know stuff about the Persians' history that the Jews don't know. But the Christians in the Middle Ages are going to get their stuff from the Jews, not the Greeks. Because remember, all that Greek literature is taken over by the Muslims when all this is taken in the Eastern Orthodox. So the Western Church is going to have Hebrew stuff, because you're going to have Jews among them, and then they're going to have Catholic stuff. But the Western Roman Catholics were not nearly as scholarly and academic as the Greeks, or as the Greek Christians that are between basically Antioch and Alexandria. They're just going to have a much deeper scholarly tradition and much older church history tradition with a lot more intersection with Greek historians and Greek philosophers and all this stuff. But because all this is lost to the Muslims, you're talking thousands of years later, the Christians just get dumber. And what they're going on is the Greek stuff. And so when they get into their modern era and they're trying to date, this is in the Enlightenment era, and they're trying to date the Exodus, they're going on based on what the Jews around them saying, and so they're putting it in the 12th century instead of the 14th century. This is not rocket science to figure out how they're wrong. It's just amazing to me that the patterns of evidence guys are starting to get there, but they're going so slow because they're not realizing why the Jews are off by a couple hundred years. And it's really simple. You just read the apocryphal literature, and you read the intertestamental literature, and you realize how jacked up their history is. I mean, they have stuff with Tobit where he's going to the capital. Like, this is another apocryphal literature, which the Christians thought should be in the Bible. The Roman Catholics have in their Bible. And it literally has stuff where it's connecting Jews in Assyria with the Second Temple period, which is 100 to 200 years after Assyria. And then it's also connecting them with Ecbatana, which is the capital of the Medes, which is after the Babylonians, and they're just skipping the Babylonians. Then they have like the priests ruling in Egypt under Nebuchadnezzar in Judith, and you can just tell all of their history in the Second Temple period, and their secular history is just jacked up all over the place with hundreds of years missing and a bunch of made-up stories that have nothing to do with the actual history. And so it's because of this that the early Christians who hold the Apocrypha in their Bible say, if this stuff is true, then Esther has to be BS. And they want to take out Esther and replace it with Wisdom, which is probably written in 90 AD. It's probably written by Alexandrian Jewish Christians after Christianity has come into play. So this bad historical record keeping becomes part of the church tradition, and it stays there in some circles to the present. Like if you look right now, you will find websites all over the place that are still placing the Exodus in the 12th century, which is so stupid because we literally have 1446 AD established by scholars all over the place. And it's like Amhos is the one who overthrew them. I mean, it's becoming so common among people who are Christian or not to reconcile that the Bible is accurate historically, and that like Amhos the first is the guy who overthrows the Jews, and then we're going to find these people like when we get the Ten Commandments movie, so the Charlton Heston Ten Commandments movie. They're going to have Nefertiti being the one who rules over the Jews, or rules with the Pharaoh. She's 200 years too early. Or it's like over 100 years too early. Yul Brenner is going to be Ramses. Ramses is not, there's not going to be a King Ramses until the Jews are in the Promised Land. So if we go to Ramses the First, the reason why they get this is because in the Bible, the city is called Ramses. Well, the reason it's called Ramses, we have tons of evidence in the Bible that the Jews would update the city names. So if they went from Proto-Hebrew to Aramaic, they're not going to call the city by a name that nobody knows it as anymore. They're going to call it by its modern name, which is why they're calling Babel, Babel in the days of Moses. They're calling Dan, Dan in the Mosaic writings because it's called Dan from the time of them entering into the captivity to the time of them leaving. So when they transfer that from Proto-Hebrew to Aramaic, they're going to put the name that everybody knows it as, which is Dan, not Laish. They're going to say that it what used to be called Laish, but they're calling it Dan, even retroacting it back into the book of Genesis. They don't want people to be confused. Okay? They want people to know where they're talking about. Well, this Ramses is 1279. So they say, well, because Moses mentions the city of Ramses, Moses didn't mention the city of Ramses. It wasn't called Ramses when Moses was alive. The people who call it Ramses are the Jews who translate it into Aramaic 1,000 years later. They're updating the city names. They're going to do that with Dan. They're going to do it with Ramses. They're going to do it with Hebron because they're going to talk about how Hebron was called Kiriath Arba, but then they changed the name back to Hebron. But it used to be Hebron, and then it became Kiriath Arba, and then it became Hebron. But when they talk about these places, they're just going to call them what they are in the time that they're translating. And they're going to do this with a bunch of different cities. So because of this, they're like, well, if they built the treasure city of Ramses, well, then it has to be Ramses. It has to be the king. That's not how that works. It's the treasure city that became the treasure city of Ramses when Ramses was in power, which was Avaris. That's how that works. And the guys at Patterns of Evidence are figuring this out, but again, the Christian community needs to put all this information together and realize where the Jews are missing 270 years. Because the Jewish calendar, watch this. $57.85, okay? The Jews say it's 57.85. Now this is the chronology of the Masoretic text if we count a 1446 Exodus, which the archaeology seems to conform to, okay? This would put the crucifixion of Christ closer to the 4,000 year mark, which makes sense because the first sun would have to rise and set before the fourth day is over. That makes sense. So 1446, according to that, see, this is Bishop Usher had 4004 BC, but he just used a strict chronological counting of the Masoretic. I did the same thing and I got 4008. But with the 1446 BCE date, you would have some overlap in some of the kings of Judah, which would erase somewhere around 44 years. And based on that, the current year would be 5983. This is what they get. 2024 from 3959. If 1446 is the model, the year Jesus was born would be 4000 according to Usher. This is adding 44 years to that, and this is going to be roughly, Jesus seems to be 37 when he dies. 4 to 6 BCE seems to be the range of dates where he lives. It does seem to put Jesus' death right around the 4,000 year mark. Okay, that is not particularly important to every prophecy. What it is the time from Jesus' death and resurrection and ascension to his second coming. That is important, but it being around 4,000 years makes more sense. And now that means we're not in the 7,000th millennium yet. We're 17 years shy of it. 17 years shy, according to this. And again, this is assuming 1446 BCE is accurate for the Exodus, and assuming that everything else in the Masoretic text is accurate. That would put, okay. That would put Christ's crucifixion in 3992 AM, okay? Very close to the 4,000 year mark. So the 4,000 year mark would be 7 years later, 7.5 years later. So roughly the year 40 AD would be 4,000 years, roughly. And that would put us 2,000 years after the Christ death and resurrection. We would be going into the millennium. Remember, Christ is going to have 3.5 years of kicking butt and taking names at 2033. And the date seems to be 7 years before that. Daniel's 70th week puts us in Christ coming to rule and reign. So again, remember, it says after 2 days, okay? So I'm not saying Jesus has to come in 2033 AD. I'm just saying that is the earliest date he could come if the Hosea 6 prophecy is saying after 2 days is 2,000 years, okay? Could he come a few years after that? Absolutely he could. That's still within 3 years, and it still puts us at the in the 7th millennium, according to the Masoretic text and according to the archaeological Exodus date. That puts us in the 7th millennium by around the year 2040. Take a few years back from that, and that puts us in Daniel's 70th week between 2033 and 2040. Could be a little before, could be after that. Remember, Jesus says if he comes in the second watch or the third watch, will you be watching? Point is, he could come a little before that, a little after that. All it seems to have to be is after 2,000 years after he left. But the second watch or the third watch seems to be, where are we? Which millennium are we in? That seems to be what Jesus is saying when he's saying if he comes in the second and third watch, will you be watching? If it's coming in the 7th millennium or just before it, will you be watching? Seems to be what he's saying. So the moral of the story with all this stuff, we need to get our calendars aligned. We need to get our timelines aligned, not for the sake of date prediction, but for the sake of justifying the Bible to go, look, now we're going to go to the Torah and the Kings list. What you end up here with, there's the Lord. Shu and Geb are basically a merger of the heavens and the earth with Adam and Eve. This is a merger of basically the light, let there be light, with God, so Elohim and the Lord, the sun god. This is Abel. This is Seth. Remember, these are the Sethites here. This is Enoch. And then these are the people that wrote their writing system, their legal system, and who knows whoever this is. Okay? They can't even tell. Okay? Then you have all these other gods. Now, according to Manetho, there were a rule of gods followed by a rule of demigods. That's what he says, okay? Right up here, number 3 is the Apis bull. Who are these? Nephilim. These are people related to the ancient humans, the founders of Egypt, and God. Great of height is his name. He's a Nephilim. Apis bull. He's a Nephilim. Who are these people? They're associated with animals, birds. Why? They're Nephilim. Possessor of noble women. This guy sleeps with whoever he wants. Protector of noble women. This guy protects all the women. And then the last one is this guy, Uraeus, which is the serpent now dignified as the god of wisdom. What do I think these are? I think these are their Nephilim rulers before the flood. So it's literally like, here are Adam, here is God, Adam, Eve, Abel, Seth, Enoch. This makes perfect sense with the Bible. And then the founders of Egypt's writing system, the founder of Egypt's laws, and whoever was probably the last legitimate king before the Nephilim started taking over and turning them into a war cult. And by the end of that, the last god or ruler that they're all reporting to is the serpent himself. They're under satanic control by the flood. After that, they have these gods, and this is in Manetho too, that are basically possessed by the spirits of other gods. Why? Because when Nephilim die, they leave demons behind. And so what do you have when these people are digging up their sites and becoming kings in those sites? They're getting possessed by the demons that were there before the flood. That's their second set of rulers. And then they have this Meni as their first king. And who is this Meni? He's probably the same guy as Min and Mantu, which are probably the last Nephilim who was there before the flood. And that's who they consider their first king. That would be my guess. Or he could be that person merged with Mizor or Mizraim. And it is Mizraim. Okay? And then you have these people who come from him. Dejer, Dejet, Dejep, Ani, Dejeb. No, you don't notice you don't have any weird god names in any of their stuff. Nijetcher, Wenetjes, Neferkara, Senjes. These just seem like names. They don't seem like theophoric god names, okay? These other ones, Neferkosar, Hujefa, Bebti, Nebka, Jozer. Now, these kings, there's a lot of them when people are still living to be a pretty long time. What I expect is these are probably kings of the heads of the different nomes. I don't think they're all a list of kings over all of Egypt. Tedi, Pepi, Neferkerti, Pepi Seneb, Neferkanim, Anu is interesting because this is probably around the time where Anu is being deified as God, so Noah being deified. Now you see Ra. Kekari Ra. So when you see the Ari at the end, that's Ra. Ra. Ra starts to come in. Then you see Mentuhotep. This is the deification of this Mentu. Okay? So if we go all the way up here, we have Menes, who I believe is Mentu. And then we have Mentuhotep. Mentu is satisfied. Mentuhotep. Amenemhat. This is Ham is the head. Amen, Ham is the head. Okay? Senuseret is, I believe its sign is powerful. So this is sign. Remember, sign is going to be deified as Sin, the god Sin. And if you look at this stuff in the king's list versus the Sumerian king's list, it aligns perfectly when sign becomes deified. Amenemhat is there's deified Ham. Ham is pleased. He's in the theophoric name. Sobek Kefneru is around the same time that Sebiu Meker. They're both associated with crocodiles for some reason, but this is probably Sheba. He probably dies and he becomes deified. Sobek Hotep, you see him again. Sekemare, I don't know. Oh, Sekemare just means he who makes, I think, Ra to shine. Amenemhat. So Amen is the head, he who makes Ra to shine. So what they are doing is Amenemhat probably signifies that Ham, the original name Amenemhat, means Ham is pleased with who's in charge. And it might have been while Ham was still alive, okay? Second Amre is he who makes Ra to shine. What does he mean? He pleases Ra, or the sun god, or who we are, okay? Hotep Abare, see there's Ra at the end. Amenemhat again, Second Amre. And again, I'm not going to do the etymology on all these, but all these have to do with being pleasing to Ra, or get the favor of Ra in some way, okay? Kanak Ra, Sobek Hotep, Renesareb, Hor. Seems to be Horus coming into the play. Well, why? They probably dug up stuff and they're calling Enoch Horus by this time. Amenemhat again. There's Sobek again, so that's Sheba. Remember, they're also taking over Nubia, and so they're probably exalting Sheba as a god as they're taking over Nubia, the same way that Akkad was exalting Sin as a god when they're taking over Shinar. There's another Ra here, and you see mostly Ra and stuff related to Sobek, which is Sheba, and Ammon, which is Ham, and Ra, which is Utu, the sun god. Those are the main ones you're seeing. Then you get down to Hori. Now remember, there is Egypt. The Edomites do drive out the Horites, which are the people of Hori, and they could potentially go into Egypt. They might be taking their ancestor Hori and making him, as their subject people, making them a god. It's possible. Because the Amalekites, which come from the Horites, are back and forth between Edom and Egypt. That's their territory. So it's possible. Then you have Ra, 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 Ra. So they're mostly monotheist. For the most part, they're monotheist. Ra, 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 Ra. Or at least the kings are mostly giving homage to Ra in their king names, okay? Ra, Ra, other guys. Now you have a Pepi, that's Apophis. Ra, 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 Ra. I mean, Ra just is all over this. So when they talk about like all of these other, now watch Manetho's King's List. They're talking about all this pantheon and all the gods that the Egyptians worship. Then why do almost all their pharaohs have Ra in their name in the oldest King's List that we have? Until we get to the era that they overthrow the Hebrews. And the answer is because they don't really have an organized pantheon. They have a bunch of different cults that they're digging up from before the flood, and then they're multiplied by 7 languages. And it's by the time you get to, because Joseph, let's go read this carefully in the Bible, Genesis 46. He's going to move all the Jews into Egypt. So then there was no bread in the land, for the famine was very sore in the land of Egypt. And the land of Canaan fainted by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan for the corn which they bought. And Joseph brought the money to Pharaoh's house. So notice all the money in Egypt and Canaan is all Pharaoh's. He has sold. So this is how Egypt and Canaan entirely become Pharaoh's servants. They don't have any money. They're selling their land for food because of Joseph's food stores, because of the Tower of Babel incident, and everything in Mesopotamia, which is the main grain belt, is falling apart. So they're not able to get grain from over there because they have a bunch of people warring over the food stores that are left as Hammurabi's empire falls apart. And they all speak different languages, so they sure as heck ain't going to give any of their grain to these foreigners across the way. Okay? So when the money failed in Egypt and in the land of Canaan, so they're all out of money, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us bread, for we should die in thy presence, for the money faileth." And Joseph says, "Give your cattle, and if I will give you for your cattle if money fails." So they're giving them all their cattle. They brought their cattle to Joseph. Joseph gave them bread in exchange for horses, for flocks, for cattle herds, for asses, and fed them with all the bread and cattle for a year. So in 1 year, he got all their horses and all their cattle, all the way up through Canaan. This is how the Egyptians take over Canaan. When that year was ended, they came in the second year and said to them, "We will not hide it from my Lord, how that our money is spent. The Lord also has our herds of cattle. There is none left in the sight of the Lord but our bodies and our lands. Wherefore we shall die in your eyes, both we and our land. Buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land will be servants unto Pharaoh, and give us seed that we will live and not die." Notice this is Egypt and Canaan. Okay? And Joseph brought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, and Pharaoh sold every man his field because the famine prevailed over them, and all the land became Pharaoh's. All the land where? Egypt and Canaan. So when they talk about how the Hyksos, they're like, the Hyksos can't be the Hebrews because they apparently are a bunch of Canaanite peoples and other Semitic peoples and stuff like this. They bought all the land of Egypt and Canaan. And then it says, and as for the people, he removed them to cities from one end of the borders of Egypt to even the other. What are the borders of Egypt? Egypt and Canaan. It's all Egypt's now. So he's removing not just Egyptian peoples from one end to the other, but also the Canaanites. And all of the Egyptian stuff about transmuting gods, idols into the gods, and all this crap is going to come in from the Canaanites too. This is where Set is going to come from, and Set is basically Baal, because it's a corruption of the Lord appearing in the storm to Job. Then Joseph said to the people, behold, I brought you this land, and Pharaoh, here is seed for you to sow the land. So he got all of their land. I want you to see how shrewd Joseph is. He is not super gracious about what he's doing. He bought all of their cattle for 1 year's worth of food. He's Jewing them hardcore. He bought all the cattle in Egypt and Canaan, horses and cattle, everything, for 1 year's worth of bread. Now he's getting their lands. Okay? He's got all their money. Look how fast he's doing this. This is like in the second or the third year of this 7-year famine. Okay? He's got his family in there safe and sound. Then he's got all the people's money. Then he's got all the people's cattle. Then he's got all the people's land. Can you see why the Egyptians might go down and say these people came in and pillaged us? Then he's moving people in and out of Canaan. He's moving Egyptians, Canaanites, probably people from Edom and Ammon and Lot as well, because they are stuck with the famine too. And unless they're getting their food by raiding, which we know they were, we know that they were raiding Mesopotamia for food, they're getting it from Egypt. So it says, it came to pass in the increase that they shall give a fifth part to Pharaoh. So after he gets all their land, he gives them seed to sow the lands with. And he says, you can keep 80% and give 20% to Pharaoh. They're all peasants now. And he said, thou hast saved our lives. Let us find grace in the sight of the Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants. Okay? They probably didn't say this so happily. But, Jews are talking about how great they are. And Joseph made a law over Egypt unto this day that Pharaoh should have the fifth part, except for the land of the priests only. Only the priests were allowed to keep their lands without having to pay this tax. Which means, who is going to lead the revolt against the Jews? Who is going to put together a pantheon that is against Ra, who Joseph is married to the high priest's daughter? The priests. And so they dwelt in Egypt, in Goshen, in the country of Goshen. That's their main territory, but they're administrating all over Egypt. And they probably have Egyptian guards and Jewish guards with them. Okay? So when they drive them out of the cities, they're not driving all the Jews out. They're just driving out the administrative Jews out of their lands. And it says, Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, and the whole age of Jacob was 147 years. So Jacob is going to live there for 17 years. We're going to find this other guy who seems to take Shechem and then some unnamed territory from the Amorites. This is supposedly an Egyptian pharaoh who claims to do this, okay? It's about a century before this. This is, again, they argue about the dates. They're saying this is in the 1800s. Well, Jacob, his sons killed Shechem, and then he takes the land from the Amorites with his sword and his bow. And I'm going to suggest to you that it's either a mix-up in the record or it's some pharaoh claiming what Jacob did. Jacob and his sons taking over this land from the Amorites and this land from the pharaohs. He's going to claim that he did that. And so then he dies, and he gives that land that he got with his bow to Manasseh. He says, the land that I took from the Amorite with my sword and my bow. So what happens? Well, Jacob's 130 when he enters into Egypt. He's an old man. So when he says, I took with my sword and my bow, which means he took by military conquest, he was probably leading. Remember, See, we think, this is what you've been told, that there's just 70 total Jews that go into Egypt, and how can 70 people multiply to 2 million? That's impossible. Okay? It's not 70. It's 70 nobles. Okay? Remember, Abraham, who is going to, Isaac is going to inherit his estate, and then Jacob is going to inherit from Isaac. Isaac dies just 5 years before Jacob goes into the promised land. Well, in the days of Abraham, he had 300 trained men. And if he has 300 trained soldiers, he probably has at least 500 to 1,000 people in his tribe. If he's got 300 trained soldiers, he is rich, and he is acknowledged by the Hittites and the Philistines as a prince among them. Okay? So if he's got that many people, that is a full 200 years before they go into Egypt. Remember, Isaac is 180 when he dies. He dies 5 years before, and this is 5 years before, or this is 13 years before Abraham has Isaac, that he has these 300 soldiers. Okay? So you do the math on it, it's 200 years later. So you have this tribe of like 1,000 that's been multiplying for 200 years. This is Isaac's estate, which probably has a small army attached to it now. Probably an army of something in the tens or 20,000s or something like that. And then you have Jacob's house, and Jacob's house takes all the women and children of Shechem. So they start out with just their dozen boys and the four women, and then Dinah, their daughter. And then they take all the women and children of Shechem. But by the time they go into Egypt, Benjamin has grandchildren. So if Benjamin has grandchildren by the time they go into Egypt, you got to remember, Joseph is 30 by the time... actually, that doesn't make sense that Benjamin has grandchildren by then. That is kind of messed up. Because if Joseph is 30 by the time he stands before Pharaoh, and it's just a few years after that, there's no way Benjamin, who's younger than him even, is going to have grandchildren by the time they go into Egypt, unless they account his grandchildren after the fact. But anyways, you're going to have all the 70 is going to include Benjamin's grandchildren. Okay, which means they have daughters and the people they're married to. They have servants. They have this tribe that was inherited by Isaac, and you have a total people of probably somewhere in, I would guess, 1,000 to 2,000 people when they go into Egypt. No, I'm sorry. It could be up to like 30,000 people when they go into Egypt. So that number of people, when you see these people multiplying for 2 million, and you see the number of the armies of Benjamin and the numbers of the army of Judah were in the 10,000, 50,000, stuff like that. Remember, that was probably all their servants too, counted as men that were trained to war. And so it's not just them. They're the nobility is those 70. Okay? So if you read this, then you read Manetho's King's List. We don't actually have a full copy of his King's List here, but we do have scraps of it that came from other Jews and stuff like that. So we have Dynasty 10, Dynasty 11, 12, 13, 15. And the dynasties that we have in modern Egypt, it's on Wikipedia, that goes on all your Egyptian scholarship, comes from him. And he makes it sound like these dynasties were just one after the other, all ruling over all of Egypt. And we know now that a lot of these dynasties were overlapping. Well, it's because of where he places these dynasties that we get the idea that Egypt is much older than it is. But we know for a fact that these dynasties overlap. And so when he goes to the 15th dynasty and he says, the 15th dynasty consisted of shepherd kings. There were 6 foreign kings from Phoenicia. Again, this is going to be in Greek in the 3rd century. So Phoenicia is what they would call the Levant or Israel. Israel's no longer a kingdom. Who seized Memphis in the Sethrite nome. So that's the nome they founded. Okay? So the Sethorite nome is a nome. Remember, the gnomes are like the farming communities that Ensi's ruled, and the nomarchs are the people who rule the gnomes. So these are basically like counties, okay? And the Sethorite nome, so this is a nome that is dedicated to Seth. A town from which a base they subdued Egypt. So this is probably Goshen. The first of these kings, Cites, they rule Seth. And you're going to find him called Salatus. Reigned for 19 years, and the Site nome was named after him. Okay? This is not true. This is probably a made-up guy that is based on Seth, or Set, which is based on the god of Seth that the Hebrews worshipped. So then they have Banan, Pachal, Stan, Arches, and Apophis, okay? Or Aphobis. No, this is... So Apophis is the name for Satan. So they have literally a god named... The first guy named Set, that is their wicked god who killed Osiris. And then their last guy is Apophis, is their name for Satan. So we can just know that this is propaganda. This is not it, okay? They came in and subdued Egypt, and what else did they do? There's other records that say they came in... Oh, let's see, right here. In the second book of his History of Egypt, this writer Manetho, so this is somebody else. This is Josephus writing Contra Eponomim. So this is Josephus remarking on Manetho's Egyptica, okay? He says, in the second books of his History of Egypt, the writer Manetho speaks of us as follows. I shall quote his own words. So we're going to assume this is a direct quote, okay? Just as if I had brought forward the man himself as a witness. To Timaeus, in his reign, for what I cause I know not, a blast of God smote us, and unexpectedly from the region of the east, invaders of an obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. By main force, they easily seized it without striking a blow. So this is the Hebrews coming in under Joseph. Remember, there's a confusion of languages going on at the same town. So the blast of God that smote us, this is something that the world would account. This is going to be all the way over in Mesoamerica, that a mighty wind came and confused everybody's languages. Okay? So a blast of God smote them. And unexpectedly from the region of the east, invaders came and obscure victory against our land. Now, they don't have a Tower of Babel myth because these would have been the people whose languages were confused. And nobody really, except for the royalty and the people who knew what was going on in Babel because they had relations in Mesopotamia and stuff like that, would know about the Babel incident. And it just so happened that the Jews had people in Mesopotamia called the Naharim, the Mitanni Naharim, the descendants of Nahor. So he says, by main force they easily seized without striking a blow, and having overpowered the rulers of the land, they then burned their cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, and treated all the natives with a cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others. This is not true. This is propaganda. They left them in state, but they did take all their land, and they did move these people across the empire, and they became slaves to Pharaoh. Finally, they appointed as king one of their number, whose name was Salatus. Now, the other one, he says Citus, which is where the Sethite nome is named after, okay? He says, he had a seat at Memphis, levying tribute from Upper and Lower Egypt, and always leaving garrisons behind in the most advantageous positions. Above all, he fortified the district to the east, foreseeing that the Assyrians, as they grew stronger, would one day covet and attack his kingdom. So this is talking about the Jews fortifying Hebron and the Golan Heights, because the Amorites were coming. And they don't know about the Amorites and the Babylonians as distinct kingdoms. In the days of the Greeks, the oldest kingdom they're aware of are the Assyrians. So you will not find them talking about anybody older than the Assyrians. So he says, in Site, the Sethorite nome, he founded a city very favorably situated on the east of the Bubasite branch of the Nile, which he called Avaris, after an ancient religious tradition. I don't know what that is. This place he rebuilt and fortified with massive walls, planting there a garrison of as many as 240,000 heavily armed men to guard his frontier. Here he would come to summertime, partly to serve out rations and pay his troops, partly to train and carefully maneuver and so to strike terror into foreign tribes. After reigning for 19 years, Salatus died, and the second king, named Banan, succeeded and reigned for 44 years. Next to him became Apashnan, and he ruled for 36 years and 7 months. Then Apophis for 61 years. Now, it turns out that the total amount of time is the time between that they would have had Joseph coming in and then the Jews getting subjugated in the generation before Moses being born. Okay? However, There's a possibility that Joseph didn't rule as prime minister the entire time he appointed a successor after he had been there for some time. But 19 years, remember, Jacob is going to be the head for 17 years before he dies. I doubt that Joseph is just going to rule for 2 years after that. So he might have had a different guy over him in Memphis, and he might have not been there anymore. But then the last one they have is Apophis ruling for 61 years. Now, first of all, just take the number of their years. To have a guy ruling for 61 years, how old must he be? Okay? The Egyptians aren't living to be this old. And yet he's got a guy named Apophis. Look at 44 years, 36 years, 50 years, 49 years. These rules are commensurate with people that probably lived to be over 100, which the Jews did. Okay? The Egyptians did not. Let's look at the Egyptian. The whole 14th dynasty is 184 years. Let's see. Oh, you guys do have guys ruling for 38 and 48 years. 46 years, 8 years, 8 years, 4 years. 38 years, 48 years. So I guess they still have guys reigning up to 40 years, but they certainly don't have guys reigning up to 60 years. That's a long reign. That's a long life. So anyways. He says the race as a whole, he called Hyksos, that is king shepherds. This is how Josephus interpreted it. It actually means, Hyksos actually means kings of foreign lands. This is what modern scholarship has figured out. Hence the compound word Hyksos. Some say that they were Arabs, and another copy expression is Hicks. Now remember, the word Arab is going to start to appear when people go from Proto-Hebrew to Aramaic, or Akkadian to Aramaic as the main script. The word Haparu is going to disappear and the word Arabs is going to pop up. The Assyrians are going to use it, and then Isaiah is going to use it during the days of the Assyrians. So we have a change in the main alphabet and the main language that's used in the Middle East, and the term Haparu is going to disappear and the term Arabs is going to pop up. So when some say that they're Arabs, well, the Arabs were mostly Hebrews. In another copy, the expression hick is said it does not mean king. On the contrary, the compound refers to captive shepherds. In Egyptian, hick, in fact, hak, when aspirated, expressly denote captives. This explanation comes to me the more convincing and the more keeping with ancient history. This is Josephus commentating. These kings whom I have enumerated above and their descendants ruling over the so-called shepherds dominated Egypt according to Matho for 511 years. This is not true. It's like 150 years. We just read it up above. Thereafter, he says, there came a revolt of the kings from Thebes and the rest of Egypt against the shepherds, and a fierce and prolonged war broke out between them. Now, Josephus is not the best historian, just so you know. He is composing a history that is based on a bunch of contemporary sources, mostly Hebrew tradition, but he is going to get those mix-ups that erase. He's going to account Esther, but he's clearly using second Esdras or first and second Esdras rather than Ezra and Nehemiah. He's very clearly using this, so he's going to get his years mixed up. It's going to be him that is going to promulgate the idea that, propagate the idea that that the Tower of Babel happened in the days of Peleg, which is just a Jewish myth. It's not what the Bible says. It says the king whose name before was Mifrag Muthosis, by a king whose name was Mifra Muthosis. Okay, which is interesting because Mifraim is Mifraim. Mifrag Muthosis. The shepherds, he says, were defeated. You know who that is? It's Amhos. And then he says, but Amhos probably has Mizraim probably in his whole name because he's over all Egypt. He says, we're defeated, driven out of all the rest of Egypt and confined to a region measuring within the circumference of 10,000 arari by the name of Avaris. So when he says he's driven them out of all of Egypt, he doesn't mean out of all of Egypt. He means with the exception of Avaris. According to Manetho, the shepherds enclosed this whole area with a high, strong wall in order to safeguard their possessions and spoils. Through Moses, so Tutmosis, which means Thoth is born, starts to be a name that is common after the Jews are overthrown, and Thoth starts to be, remember that's the guy who invented the Egyptian writing system, starts to be deified and show up in the theophoric names. the son of Mithrathmosis, so that's Amhos. He continues and attempted to siege the forced them to surrender, blockaded the forces with an army of 480,000 men, finally giving up the siege in despair. He concluded a treaty with them that they should all depart from Egypt and go unmolested where they pleased. On these terms, the shepherds, with their possessions and households complete, no fewer than 240,000 people, which makes sense if they're in the tens or 20,000s, and this is 150 years later. That makes sense that they're a 250,000 by that time. Left Egypt and journeyed over the desert into Syria, there dreading the power of the Assyrians, who were at that time masters of Asia. Not true. They built the land now called Judea, a large city enough to hold all the thousands of people, and gave it the name Jerusalem. Okay, so again, this is Manetho writing this history based on probably a combination of contemporary sources and Egyptian hieroglyphics. However, it's clear that this is not accurate history because he thinks the Assyrians, when the Egyptians are still ruling over Canaan, they have treaties and relationships and even wars with the Mitanni. And also you have the Kassites ruling over Babylon that are going to come into Canaan, and also the Hittites. So the fact that he's saying that the Assyrians are ruling over all of Asia, he is clearly looking at Greek sources who think the Assyrians are the oldest people they are. The Assyrians didn't become powerful. They didn't start to expand outside of their region by the Tigris until around the time of King David and Solomon. And at that point, it still took them about 300 to 400 years to get to the point where they're just ruling over all the Aramaeans, which are, Aram Naharim. Okay? By the time, the Mitanni kingdom has fallen, the Aram Naharim become basically subject to Assyria, they're still going back and forth over who's ruling Babylon for centuries. And it's by the time they finally pin down Babylon, they destroy it and then rebuild its walls and stuff like that, that they come into the Levant. So the fact that he thinks the Jews built Jerusalem to safeguard them from the Syrians because they were scared, his history sucks. So it says in another book of his history of Egypt, Manetho says that the race of so-called shepherds, so Manetho wrote like 5 books, okay? He says in the sacred books of Egypt described as the captives, and his statement is correct. With our remotest ancestors, indeed, it was a hereditary custom to feed sheep, and as they lived a nomadic life, they were called shepherds. On the other hand, in the Egyptian records, they're not unreasonably styled captives, since our ancestor Joseph told the king of Egypt that he was captive, and later, with the king's consent, summoned his brothers to Egypt. But I shall investigate the subject more fully in another place. So again, this is the same thing. This is according to Julius Africanus. He's apparently reading it too. So you have Josephus and Julius Africanus, both who are reading Manetho's Egyptica and putting these accounts of Joseph and what Manetho's accounting. So we see what Manetho is accounting, and even the fact that it's very close to the time and the people of the Hyksos is pretty obvious. Okay, now why do your modern scholars not just say, even your patterns of evidence guys don't say that the Hyksos were the Hebrews? Why? Well, because Josephus has kind of been debunked, and more precise archaeology are claiming, well, it's not just the Hebrews, it's other Semitic peoples and Canaanite peoples that seem to be clumped in as the Hyksos. And the answer is, well, yes, because the Jews had all kinds of servants from that era. They're a minority. They're the nobles of these people, but they're not the majority of them genetically. It's very simple. So the people are going to be Canaanite Semitic mix, but surprise, surprise, the ruling lords of those people are going to be the house of Jacob. See, people think that just because Jacob had this small family that he never had more people than that, but they don't realize that Isaac died 5 years before they went into Egypt, and that whole estate that was Isaac's in Hebron would have become theirs. And that's why Jacob, remember, this is going to be like the last 22 years of his life, he's going to have an army, basically. And that's why he's going to go take the land from the Amorite with his sword and his bow, which is accounted. So he says, moreover, I have given thee one portion above thy brethren, which I took out of the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow. He's telling you he waged war against the Amorites before he died. So people just need to read the Bible more carefully, and then they need to read their history and archaeology and use common sense before they just submit to the secular historical consensus, okay? The information is all there. The Bible is true. The gods match. The gods just match the deification of ancestors. The timelines match. And then most of what people consider to be the Egyptian pantheon of Ra and Ptah and Thoth and Ammon, all these different gods that seem to appear, this new pantheistic religion seems to emerge when the Egyptians overthrow the Hebrews. And it's after that that Akhenaten is trying to bring Egypt back to what it was before that. So Akhenaten is trying to bring everyone back under Aten, which is just another version of Ra. Okay. However, you have in the Book of the Dead that Aten is this foreigners. It's not the real Ra. It's this Tenu or whatever that was brought in by the Eastern foreigners who invaded. So this is why the Egyptians hate this. They're like, that's the Jews' version of God, the high God. And they hate that. And so what they do is they get rid of this guy. And so you see the date of these, 1336 BC to 1334 BC, okay? You're talking about within 110 years of the Jews leaving Egypt. So the Jews are now in Canaan. Joshua has died. He's beat the crap out of everyone in Canaan. You have Caleb and Othniel in, and you're around the time that Othniel has defeated the Kassites. So the Kassites had been subduing them, and Othniel is going to come up and defeat them, and that's going to lead to the decline of the Kassite Empire, which is ultimately going to allow Assyria to rise. The Jews have proved themselves powerful. The Jews are reigning over a land that used to be part of Egypt. Their gods have kicked the crap out of the Egyptian gods. And it's around this time that you're going to have the Amarna letters. The modern name for the ancient Egyptian capital of Akhenaten. He's the one who gets the Amarna letters. And what are the Amarna letters telling him? The Amarna letters are the people all over that are saying these Haparu are coming in and they're taking all of our stuff. Help us, help us, help us. We're supposed to be a protectorate of Egypt, and these Haparu are coming in and taking all of our stuff. So Akhenaten realizes these are the guys whose God destroyed Egypt about 110 years ago. It's definitely documented in their records, their royal records especially, okay? He knows who this God is, and these Jews who worship this Yahweh, who they believe before them worshipped Ra exclusively, because that's the priesthood who Joseph is married into, they're going to say, that's God. That's the only God. That's their God, and so we're going to go back to worshiping exclusively Ra or Aten. And that's Akhenaten means. So Akhenaten, let's see what that means. So effective of Aten. So he seems to be working at the behest of Aten. What he's trying to do is lead Egypt back to repentance from their pantheon, which hasn't been around that long. Again, you have these different god cults that have existed, but the idea of Egypt officially being under this pantheon, remember, this is the idea of an official pantheon is something that seems to be invented in Akkad, and now they're doing it. Okay, they're trying to get rid of this and repent and go back to just worshiping the one true God, who they believe to be the Son of Justice. Okay, and Akhenaten's going to do this. And he is eventually going to be labeled a revolutionary, heretic, fanatic, insane madman. He is the husband of Nefertiti. This is where the Jews get wrong and put this Nefertiti as a woman who had the hots for Moses. Okay. His children are going to include. Well, his father was Amenhotep, which means Amen is satisfied. His successor is to be Semenkari. Which is basically his wife. And then after her, Tutankhamun, King Tut. And King Tut means, I believe it's Thoth something. So his original name, see, these people are going to have their birth names and then their royal names, okay? So his father's original name was Amenhotep IV, which means Amen is satisfied. Ham is satisfied, okay? But his royal name, when he takes the throne, is going to be effective for Aten. So he's trying to bring people back under monotheism. His son, remember, he's going to die. Maybe he's going to get murdered. Who knows? It says another one of his names is Nefer Keherperi. Beautiful are the manifestations of Ra, the one of Ra. Very clearly, he's saying Ra is the one true God. Ra is the son of justice, the son of righteousness. And then he's going to say his son, he's going to name him Aten, image of the life of Aten. Image of the life of Aten. That's what he's going to name his son. So he's going to make his son the new Joseph. That's his goal. He's trying to bring Egypt back to its glory because it's been decimated ever since they turned on the Hebrews. And it says he's going to change it to Tutankhamen, image of the living Amen. So he's going to bring it back to Amen-Ham instead of Aten. And they're eventually going to merge Amen and Aten as Amen-Ra, because Aten is another version of Ra. And he's going to start being pharaoh at 8 or 9 years old. What happened? His dad was probably murdered by the priesthood. That would be my guess. Let's see if we can figure this out. Reign, death. Oh, he's going to have a co-reign with Nefertiti, it looks like. He died after 17 years of rule and was initially buried in the tomb of the royal Wadi in order to construct a tomb and burial, blah, blah, blah. In the years following his burial, Akhenaten sarcophagus was destroyed and left in Akhenaten necropolis, were constructed in the 20th century, the Egyptian Museum of Cairo. So his tomb was desecrated, his image was taken off. They hated this guy. And this is probably similar to when you have in Byzantium, you're going to have the kings who try to destroy all the idols. And then after they die, their wives reinstitute the old priestly policy because the priests are manipulating their wives. And this is probably what happens with him. So his wife is ruling after he dies because their son's not old enough yet. And they desecrate his tomb. They erase his name off of everything they can. And then King Tut comes in. And after King Tut, I believe, are the Ramses that come in. So King Tut is followed by I don't know who that is. Followed by Horemheb, don't know who that is, and then Ramses the first is 2 after him. So by the time we're here, we're about halfway through the book of Judges, and the Danites are heavily taking over the place. You're going to probably have Deborah and Barak and Gideon around this time, and that's when Ramses comes in. So this Ramses is going to claim to be going up and taking over, conquering outside of Egypt, but we don't have evidence that he did, besides from him saying it. Same thing with Tutankhamen. Tutankhamen is going to be making claims that he's, this mighty king and warrior and stuff like this, and it looks like he was probably a cripple. This is propaganda. The Egyptians love to lie. They love to create propaganda because, again, if you're ruling over all of Egypt, you want people to think you're fighting your enemies on the outside, these enemies, these invaders from the east, which is going to be their major fear, right? Like, you're not with us, you're with the terrorists, right? And it's going to be their major fear to keep promoting the fact that they're defending them from these guys of the east. And this is why they need to keep remaining in power over all of Egypt. Nubia in the south, and then the invaders from the east, which are coming up from Canaan. Which in reality, the Nubians probably are somewhat of a threat, but it's more the Egyptians oppressing the Nubians because Nubians have gold mines. And then you're going to have the Israelites are never invading. The Canaanites are never invading Egypt. It's only the Hyksos, or the Hebrews, that are ever in power in Egypt, but they're going to claim that they are always out there trying to invade, and so the Egyptians need to keep going out and make war on them. They're going to claim that they went out and destroyed the city, and they do that during once in a while. We find a pharaoh coming out and destroying a city and giving it to his daughter-in-law when Solomon is married to the king of Egypt. So we know the Egyptians are still going to go into Canaan once in a while and fight and conquer a city and plunder some stuff, but they're always going to exaggerate how much they're doing and how big their armies are and their enemies are. The main people they're rivaling with over Canaan are the Hittites, and that's in the period after they subjugate the Israelites. And once the Israelites come into Canaan, I think they might have one more battle with the Hittites, and that's it. The Hittites start to decline after that because the Hittites are getting defeated by Joshua, and then the Danites seem to be allying with the Greeks and the Japhethites against the Hittites in Anatolia. And the Danites basically take Troy out of the hands of the Hittites. And that starts with the Hittite decline because they don't have that route to the bronze mines in the east anymore, or in the west anymore, from Cornwall, the tin from Cornwall, England, and the bronze from Crete, which would have been coming in through Troy. They now are getting their bronze exclusively from Afghanistan, which is between them and Afghanistan is the Assyrians and the Mesopotamians and a whole bunch of Japhethites who don't like the Hittites oppressing them. So those kingdoms basically all turn in on the Hittites and eventually destroy the Hittite Empire. That's it. That's all we're going to cover. The point is, the moral of the story of all this stuff is that if you look at these theophoric names, this is the technical term for having the name of a god involved in the name. You're going to find El all over the Hebrew names. Very common thing. God is great. God is good. And then you're going to find these other gods. Ammon. Thoth is Tut. Re is Ra. Ammon is Ham. Most of them are going to go back to this Ennead. Seti is Set. They're mostly going to go back to this Ennead of 9 gods. And I believe the reason they count 9 of them is because of the original thing of the scarab, which signifies Ra, and then the 8 in the boat. And that's why they think there must be 9 original gods. Ra and then the 8 gods. Okay? And this is where Herodotus seems to get that the Egyptians originally have 8 gods, and then they go to 12 gods, which are probably the Hebrew patriarchs, who are super BA, and they each have tribes of people underneath them who are answering to them, and armies, and they're taking over Canaan, they're taking over Egypt, and they're making Egypt great again. The Jews bring Egypt into the height of its power, and it never, ever, ever comes back anywhere close to what it was when the Jews were co-ruling with the Egyptians. And so when people want to erase the Jews from history and pretend they were never here, that's super sad, because you are missing all this very clear information that doesn't just coordinate the Bible, it coordinates all your archaeology too. It makes so much sense. So I hope you guys are blessed by this. Again, as this is going on, remember you're going to have the Hittites over here, you're going to have the Assyrians, the Mesopotamians, these are going to be the Kassites, these are the descendants of Cush, who are probably the relatives of Nimrod. And then the Assyrians starting to rise over here, and they're going to mostly be in Ashur and Nineveh, and then come over here and eventually take over this Aramaean region. But that's going to take place over hundreds of years. So please go back and watch some of my Bible stuff on Joshua and the kingdoms of David and the stuff that was going on, because I keep talking about these other kings. But all of this stuff is going to be consolidated into this book, A Serpent by the Way, which is going to essentially be a companion to your Old Testament that's kind of telling you what's going on with the pagans the whole time, and all the pagan religions and stuff like that. So I'm hoping to have this book published by next year. If you guys are enjoying this content and you're like, wow, this is a bunch of information I didn't know, please look at my Rightly Dividing book, which covers church history in this way. It shows you where all the politics and the false religions, the occults and the monastic movements and the Illuminati and all this crazy crap are alongside the church. And this is basically going to be the prequel to that. Okay, the New Testament translation is the Apostles' teaching, and then Rightly Dividing is the church history, and then Revelation, Every Eye Will See Him is how the end times is going to go down. Okay, my goal is to have all this information in you guys' hands, so if you aspire to be Bible teachers, or just to not be deceived as the whole world is getting deceived very quickly, well, these are companion, these are tools to help you, but mostly stay in the Word. I don't recommend you guys listening to the Book of the Dead. It's a lot of creepy stuff. It's just a lot. I mean, It's not that creepy, but you know it has demonic origins, and it's just about the Egyptians saying magic words and phrases and appealing to this god and that god to try to stop their bodies from decaying and make it into the afterlife. The Egyptians are obsessed with trying to have eternal life by knowledge and trying to preserve their bodies. It's everything that they're about. That's why they get into makeup and all this stuff. And this stuff seems to come from before the flood. All the stuff that the Jews seem to believe in the books of Enoch and in the books of Jubilees and stuff like that, that talk about the angels teaching the people makeup and all this stuff, seems to come from the Egyptians and somewhat from the Babylonians. It doesn't seem to be from any historical Hebrew sources. It seems to be coming from them mixing with the Magi in the east and the Egyptian mysteries in the west. And then the Essenes kind of consolidate that and have their own little cult, basically, that is at Qumran and Masada. So I'm not a fan of the Essenes. If you guys hear that stuff, I'm not impressed with that. I hope you guys are blessed with this. Hope you have a great rest of your weekend. Batman out. Peace.
Peace, I'm out. I'm Batman.